Gladiatorial combat may seem outdated and barbaric, but it is, at its heart, a combat sport like mixed martial arts, boxing, and even professional wrestling with very similar appeal. There were clearly defined rules, a sense of dramatic flair with costumes and even character archetypes. It was indeed bloody, but not nearly as fatal as many people think. Not every gladiator died in the arena, and those who made it past their first handful of matches, even less so. This isn't to say that gladiator fights didn't come with many deaths. For example, gladiator combat was usually accompanied by other events such as parades, animal hunts, glorified prisoner executions dressed up as combat practice for gladiators, and even occasional audience fatalities. But how did the games get started? What was life actually like for a typical gladiator? And how did these ubiquitous games rather suddenly cease to be a thing after so many centuries of widespread extreme popularity? To begin with, the first known gladiator game was held in 264 BC in honor of a deceased Roman aristocrat put on by the aristocrat's sons. The gladiators in this one were slaves that seemed to be captured from outside of Rome. As the outcome, well, unfortunately, we don't know if the first gladiators in this event lived or died, simply that it was a three-way match between three gladiators. While gladiator games would be held throughout Roman history for various reasons, this particular occasion of honoring someone who just died persisted. In fact, upon the death of a Roman aristocrat in a given region, the masses even began expecting games and would sometimes revolt if they weren't held after such a death. For example, Suetonius noted, upon the death of one aristocrat, the people of his city refused to let the body be buried unless his family held gladiatorial games. This eventually led to a revolt that had to be put down by Emperor Tiberius. That said, it should be noted that funerary gladiator games were not held for everyone. Equestrians and plebeians, even very rich ones, did not get funerary gladiator games held in their honor, just the patricians like the senatorial class. They also did not happen frequently, and you were lucky if you had 2 a year in a given town. Even a city as big as Rome did not usually see that many per year. In any event, the gladiator games would start to cement as Romans spread out into the world and took the games with them. Slaves captured in wars were sometimes sold to a gladiator school or a ludus. As Rome expanded, there was a growing pool of slaves and new territories in which gladiatorial combat became popular as a part of spreading Roman culture. It was a machine that fed itself and could only grow as Rome was growing. Gladiatorial schools owned a familia gladiatoria, or a gladiator troupe of slaves and free men and women. On this note, there were also free volunteers, usually thrill seekers or people down on their luck. These individuals typically paid to join the school, negotiated terms with the school owner, and were treated better than their slave colleagues. They could also leave whenever they wanted if they bought out their contract. Each troupe was run by a manager or an owner called a Lannister, usually a freed gladiator himself. Training as a gladiator was harsh, so harsh that there were protocols to ensure that the gladiators in training did not try to end their own lives. They were chained and lived in rooms devoid of anything they could hang or stab themselves with. As they fought and gained a reputation, they moved up in the hierarchy of gladiators and gained better accommodations. If you have something to gain by living, you don't necessarily resort to ending your own life to escape a bad situation. Lower gladiators, however, were kept under lock and key, and their movements were limited. We do have some examples of gladiators sharing a room with their so-called wives, such as Spartacus, keeping in mind that legally slaves could not marry. Gladiators could have children with these women and live as a family, sometimes in private houses if the gladiator was successful enough. Groupies and prostitutes were also allowed into the gladiators' private quarters, depending on their level in the hierarchy. Gladiators could have some sort of domestic life, and often when freed, their families also became freed and paid tribute to their father in posthumous memorials. The schools also employed experts, also freed gladiators to train in one or more combat styles, which we'll get into shortly. They ran drills with the recruits and showed them how to fight according to their style. The experts and trainees practiced with wooden swords, approximately twice as heavy as the swords they would ultimately fight with. The same was true for wooden shields, as well as wooden posts as tall as a person. They also practiced various offensive and defensive drills known as dictata. These were seen as the basics of their style of combat, and audience members were known to call out the dictata that they wanted to see, essentially exhorting the gladiators to fight in a way that they found to be exciting. These drills were important to the training of a gladiator, and experienced gladiators could build off of them to have more interesting or efficient fights. The hierarchy within the gladiator class or style was based on the victory record of the fighter. Trainees who had not had their first fights were usually considered the lowest. Noteworthy on this one, many did not survive their first fight. After these beginners came 4 levels of hierarchy, within the first 2 considered the lowest. The top levels were where being a gladiator gladiator got really interesting. This is where you started to be known as a commodity and started building a bona fide fan base. The hierarchy was maintained by those with the same fighting style, with the top level of each style being considered the troops' main draws. As for health, their diets and conditions was regulated to ensure that they were as healthy as possible. For example, many cities famed for gladiator schools were coastal cities, with the fresh air supposedly healthier for the gladiators. Gladiator diet was also barley heavy, to the point of barley men becoming a nickname for these fighters. As to why such a diet, it was said that barley fattened the arteries and made it harder for the gladiators to bleed to death. However, in reality, barley was probably used because it was cheap. This was important as gladiators ate a lot, even more than the average soldier, to the point that they could put a stress on regions undergoing famine. To help regulate their diet and ensure that gladiators were in good health, the schools hired physicians and cooks. On the former, no greater a physician than Galen, considered by many the greatest medical researcher of his era, worked for a gladiator school for a time. Notably, Galen doubted the barley diet was optimal here and worked to change the diet of his gladiators. In the process of his work here, he gained invaluable experience, which helped him develop his medical theories beyond. Another facet of maintaining good health was massage, with masseuses employed by the schools to help ensure the gladiators were fighting in top form. Going back to the schools themselves, as gladiator combat became more popular and politicians saw its potential as a political tool, upper classes and even the empire itself bought schools from their original Lannistae. In fact, Julius Caesar himself owned a school of about 1,000 gladiators. It was such a part of his political career that other senators attempted to limit his promotions indirectly by legally limiting how many gladiators could be in combat in any given time. Octavian inherited Caesar's school, and it was passed on throughout the Julio-Claudian dynasty of emperors. Some emperors, like Nero, opened separate schools than the imperial one, while others integrated them more into their administration by placing high-ranking members of the court into the school's administration. Imperial schools could be found all over Rome and the Eastern and Western empires. They were considered a cut above the regular schools and could even be rented out, just like the others, for a heftier price. Roman politicians followed suit and bought their own schools. Economically, it made sense for an aristocrat to buy a school. Since politicians were usually the editor, they incurred the cost of the dead gladiators and the cost of setting up a venue, so why not own the school? And this all brings us to the types of fighters used here. As alluded to, Rome had many types of gladiators that fell in and out of style depending on the era or region. However, there are some primary types of gladiators found in almost any era and place. The horsemen, who fought on white horses with golden helmets, a tunic, round shields, and lances as weapons. They also wore a single shoulder armor called a manica, which most other gladiators wore as well. Noteworthy here is that despite the name, horsemen could fight on the ground as well as on horseback. There were also the retiarius, usually a good-looking man or woman who fought without a helmet but with a net, trident, or small blade. Next up, different types of sword and shield wielders existed, like the Memoriae, Thracian, and Circus. They all had helmets, swords, and shields with a distinct design for each style of fighting. A gladiator could specialize in 1 to 3 of these styles. The ecclesiasticism was probably to remain interesting in the arena, but also to ensure a career as a trainer in several styles as one's fighting career began to wrap up. Originally, these styles, like the Thracian, were based on peoples Rome were at war with. As the empire grew and these locals became assimilated, the names changed and new styles were added to represent further foes. For example, the Miramiello used to refer to the peoples in what is now modern France, but the name was changed to Fish People to more suit the look of the armor. We should probably also explicitly mention here that there were female gladiators. Female gladiators were not tied down to a singular female-only style and could also specialize in more than one style of fighting. As for what gladiators got up to in the matches, this could be all over the map. As noted, in the first game of 264 BCE, it was a 3-way match between the 3 slave gladiators. As the sport became more refined, however, one-on-one matches became common. That didn't mean there weren't, say, 74-man matches in later Roman history, because there were massive battle royales between trained gladiators. However, most of the large-scale matches were between criminals whose lives were less valuable, or not really valuable at all, rather than trained gladiators. This would eventually be a part of the experience of going to the gladiator games. Sometimes these prisoners would recreate sea battles, complete with battleships, sacking of villages, and other key Roman victories. The idea was the prisoners got a chance to die like brave Roman soldiers, while the masses were thoroughly entertained by their deaths. In fact, many were expected to die in these battles, to the point that once during a recreation of a sea battle, Emperor Claudius was misheard to be offering the prisoners a pardon. This misunderstanding caused the prisoners to revolt. In any event, while trained gladiators did die during their less frequent multi-man battles, these were spectacles rather than the norm, at least compared to one-on-one matches. Moving on to people who fought animals in the arena, these were not considered gladiators, though they were eventually sourced from the same pool of slaves and trained in similar schools. However, they were called venatores, and they were seen as slightly more respectable than their gladiator colleague hunters who fought against all sorts of animals, but mostly predators. To fit the bill, they fought wearing the clothes and equipment of a hunter, a tunic, a spear for thrusting, and a spear for throwing. Venators could come from all over the empire, and typically were well versed in how to handle animals, exotic to wherever they were fighting. Another class of beast fighter, named, beast fighter, is more linked in the mind of the spectators to the gladiator. In all likelihood, these were gladiators that started to fight in events meant for venators, a sort of crossover spectacle. That said, there is a lot of disagreement between scholars as to what the beastmen were. Some scholars say they fought with heavy armor for a time, others say light armor. Some say the term is used to refer to people thrown to animals as an execution, while others say the beastmen were assistants to the venators and trained the animals. Yet another class of beast fighter consists of the animals themselves. Some events pitted exotic animals against each other. Animals found in the arena included leopards, lions, rhinos, bulls, bears, and others. Venators, beastmen, and animals were also susceptible to the crowd's bloodthirst, and they could be condemned or spared in the arena. Events involving animals were well regarded, and the crowds, both high and low, appreciated seeing animals from far-off lands. In fact, so popular were these animal spectacles that hunting animals for the arena led to the extinction of some animals such as the Nile hippopotamus. This all brings us to what a day at the games was actually like more specifically. For starters, these were usually free events, as most expenses were paid by the person putting on the show, the editor, or by the editor splitting the bill with the city. It was also an all-day affair beginning in the morning. A procession opened the games in which the editor and gladiators were paraded to the audience. This was usually considered the most boring part of the card and was not advertised. That said, the procession was still an important part of the games, as it was where the editor showed off for the audience, attempting to curry favor for the event they were, in a sense, sponsoring. Afterwards, there was typically a beast hunt. The beast hunts were welcomed, and while they weren't the main event as mentioned, they were enjoyed by the high and low classes alike. In the afternoon were the noonday spectacles, usually execution events. The editor purchased prisoners from the local prisons to be executed in various ways. Noonday spectacles could be recreations of Roman victories for larger arenas and smaller-scale combat between condemned men for smaller arenas. Usually these men were forced to fight animals, gladiators, or each other. Other times they were executed in basic ways like hanging and burning, or in more vicious and elaborate ways such as having a stake shoved through the back of the head, or quartering. The memory of the noonday spectacle lives largely in Christian lore, as many early Christians were executed rather brutally during this portion of the event. Aristocrats and intellectuals usually disliked the levels of bloodshed of this part of the games and went home for lunch to return later when the gladiators came out. In the meantime, you could buy souvenirs of your visit and even potentially luck out in receiving giveaways from particularly wealthy editors that could span anything from free food to whole apartment buildings and farms if you were really lucky. On the not-so-fun side, the sweet aroma of animal feces, blood, sweat, and opened, rotting flesh was a thing. To combat these odors, perfume and water mixed with saffron was usually sprayed on the audience. Going back to the main event, there was typically a little warm-up show where the gladiators showed off practicing and performing monologues against their opponents. From here, the first gladiators to fight were the horsemen, usually fighting other horsemen. And just in general, once the combat portion of the game started, it was pretty comparable to a modern combat sport supercard or pay-per-view, with the gladiator matches lasting around 10 to 15 minutes, with around 12 matches to a card, running around 3 hours, although sometimes games could be stretched into several days in this way. Between matches, decisions would be called to either break ties or decide the fate of the combatants by the editor. Viscera and blood were also cleaned off the arena as best as possible by sand or water. On this one, our term for arena actually comes from the Latin word for sand, arena. Matches were refereed much like modern combat sports. This was to ensure that the fights were being fought fairly and to make sure they didn't get too boring. If action died down too much, the gladiators could be whipped to encourage them to fight more dramatically. As alluded to at the end of a fight, if a gladiator did not get killed, the audience voiced their decision, while the editor made the final decision on who lived and died. As to voicing their thoughts, the fate of the gladiator in terms of whether the audience was voting for a kill was decided with what is known as a police verso, a Latin term which roughly translates to turned thumb. More precisely what this means isn't known, and there are no accounts that have survived to this day that describe it in any real detail. As such, we're unable to say for sure which way the thumb was supposed to be pointed if the audience wanted a given gladiator to be killed, or if they could just wave their thumb around at random, which it seems may well have been the case. So, that's voting for death. What about life? The gesture to spare a given gladiator's life seems to have been neither a thumbs up nor a thumbs down. Instead, you had to hide your thumb inside your fist, forming a gesture known as a police compresso or compressed thumb. The reason for this has been speculated to be twofold. One, it made the decision of the crowd easier to discern, since it's easier to tell the difference between a thumb turned and a closed fist than a thumbs up and a thumbs down from a long ways away. And two, the gestures themselves are thought to be largely symbolic of what they represented. A pointed thumb represented the audience's desire for the victorious gladiator to deliver his coup de grace, stab the fallen foe, while a hidden thumb symbolized that they wished for the gladiator to stay his blade, sheathing it much in the way that hidden their thumb. Hence why it's thought turned thumb may well have been simply waving your thumb around in the air, perhaps in a stabbing motion. In any event, the crowd seems to have done these gestures rather than the editor, but once their opinions were seen, the editor could decide several things: mercy for both gladiators, mercy for the defeated, ordering the winner to kill the defeated gladiator, complete manumission of one or both combatants, or giving the winner the choice to end his opponent's life. Noteworthy here is that the editor footed the bill on any slain or freed gladiator, perhaps slightly incentivizing them to keep them alive, especially if they were an accomplished fighter. As for the broad death rates, just like modern combat sports, the crowd could be more or less bloodthirsty depending on the era and the region, and their reactions to sparing a gladiator could vary. But it is known that gladiators tended to live after a fight much more so than the media would make it seem. And these individuals often had fight records comparable to modern boxers or mixed martial arts fighters today. That said, despite the extreme fame some of these individuals reached, gladiators never really enjoyed the respectability of their Greek athletic predecessors or their modern combat sports antecedents, and gladiators were considered a lowly class in Roman society. And when we say low, we mean very low. For example, a common way to soothe the mother of a dead child was to assure her that at least he didn't grow up to be a gladiator. That said, that didn't stop Emperor Commodus from getting in the arena more than 700 times in essentially fixed matches, and gladiators did have their adoring fans, some of whom went out of their way to meet them, have spicy time with them, and even memorialize them if they died in the arena. Probably the most famous gladiator of all, Spartacus, even led a revolt against the Roman Republic in 73 BCE, the largest slave revolt in Rome. This all may now be wondering how exactly these incredibly popular games finally and rather abruptly went the way of the dodo. Or remember how we mentioned Christians were rather brutally executed during gladiatorial games for the amusement of the masses? Well, a lot of early Christians were killed this way. As you might imagine from this, Christian writers were rather hostile towards the games, either because their fellow Christians were killed in them, or because of the bloodlust the games inspired in their audience, which kind of went against the whole love your neighbor thing. As such, as Rome Christianized, church leaders put up more and more resistance to the games. In the late 4th century, the church even made baptism impossible for gladiators and their trainers. Schools closed up, and the games became an ever more rare part of Roman life. Things finally ceased completely when in 404 CE, a monk named Telemachus was stoned when he ran into one of the last active arenas to beg the crowd to disperse. His death led Emperor Honorius to close the arenas for good, with the last game probably happening in 410. This ends the gladiator games while Rome was still an entity, is most likely why the games didn't persist among the European, Byzantine, or Muslim inheritors of Rome, despite many of the old arenas and Colosseums surviving in those locales, and that the human thirst for watching extreme combat existed before Rome and continues to this day, just now with less slavery, mass executions, and while crowds might scream for one opponent to destroy the other, the runners of the event aren't deciding if the athletes live or die after a match. One of the lasting legacies of Rome in modern society is the concept of the Senate, though it wasn't really what we think of as a Senate today. In many countries today, you can find a similar governing body of elected or appointed representatives. If you dive a little deeper, you can see different countries have very different ideas of what a Senate is. Usually in a bicameral legislature, this is when a country has more than one legislative body and the Senate acts as the higher assembly. This role can be official and the members are elected, such as the American Senate. In other countries, it is symbolic and made up of appointees, such as the Canadian Senate, not to be confused with the Ottawa Senators, who are a bad hockey team. However, the Roman Senate was very different from either the American, Canadian, or quite possibly any modern legislative body calling itself a Senate. Rome's trauma as a former kingdom plays a major role in the mythology of the Senate, both in its rise and its downfall. In the regal period of Rome, Rome had its political and religious institutions established by kings. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, established much of its political institutions. Among those political innovations he produced was was the Senate. They were elders from the top families of Rome and were 100 members. Upon the legendary disappearance of Romulus in 716 BCE, the Senate began a year-long process to choose the next king, showing that in the absence of a king, the Senate had a role to play even so early in Rome's history. The religious institutions that were then created were typically ascribed to the second king, Numa. He established the religious role of the Senate and established most of the early priesthoods. The Senate chose the third king, Tullus Hostilius, in 672, and he built the Senate house and established Rome's military and martial traditions. According to Roman legends, the neighboring Etruscans then conquered them, and they struggled with the Etruscan king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus. Lucius Junius Brutus deposed the last king in 512 and established the Republic. The Senate dissolved the king's powers between them, magistrates, and other positions. There were no clearly defined roles shared between the legislative and executive branches of the early Roman Republic. Eventually, the Senate and the magistrates' powers became more clearly defined. While scholars tend to be more sober about the shortcomings of Roman republicanism than they are about Greek democracy, it is still important to keep in mind that Roman republicanism is still not our modern republicanism or democracy. There are key differences. For one, the Roman Senate was not egalitarian, even symbolically like the assemblies. It was an aristocratic body, and one that had a lot of power invested in it. The senators saw themselves as belonging to the upper patrician class, and they enacted policies and laws that benefited their families and self-interests. In other words, there was corruption, and a lot of it. This corruption was intended to keep the senatorial class in power and enrich individual members. This meant that senatorial families held a lot of power, which would eventually lead to the undoing of the Senate and its restructuring during the Principate era. Another factor was that there was no democracy, not even a shred of it. Other than the Senate and the complex system of elected and appointed positions like consul, magistrate, proconsul, and so on, there were also assemblies. The assemblies were the closest thing to a democratic body, but that is only if you really squint hard. It was dominated by the upper classes, and the plebeians, the ordinary citizenry, were vastly underrepresented. They usually just consisted of one voting bloc. The nature of how the assemblies worked meant that the plebeian representatives often didn't even get a chance to vote. The relationship between the assemblies and the Senate is a complicated one, as each had their own source of powers, and the assemblies were meant to represent the will of the people, even though in practice it represented the wealthy. In wars, the senators made out like bandits. Well, really the legionaries did, but the senators pocketed much more than the average legionary could. From spoils of wars, including civil wars, senators could make a lot of money. Senators were already very rich during the Republic. Depending on the era and until property requirements were lifted, a legionary needed to own property valued anywhere between 100 to 400 denarii. In contrast, senators owned tens of millions worth of such property, which included large estates and farms in the country or estates in the city staffed with tens of hundreds of slaves. Legionaries, on the other hand, lived quite meagerly. When Caesar raised the salary of a legionnaire from 125 to 225 denarii a year, it was still considered too little, yet senators lived off much more. This was in a period when Rome was constantly expanding, both into Italy and out into other parts of the Mediterranean. There was more than enough money to go around and plenty of issues keeping the legion in line and staffed. A little extra for the soldiers would have gone a long way, but the Senate was more than happy to pocket the lion's share. Another key difference between our modern Senate and the Roman Senate is that the Roman Senate was in no way a secular institution. In all this, it's important to understand that our modern ideas of religion and secularism are not something the Romans would acknowledge. They had very different ideas of what religion and politics were and how far the two overlapped. One could say our modern understanding of both and insistence on their separation is a long evolving discourse coming from a Christian critique of Roman religion and politics. On all this, Roman religion had four main colleges of priests. Number one, the College of the Pontiffs, which had various roles that ranged from the Vestal Virgins to the Pontifex Maximus, or head priest. It was the most varied of the colleges. Second, the Augurs, who read divinations for the Senate and the army, as well as inaugurated temples and sacred spaces. Third, the Decemviri, who were priests dedicated to the Sibylline books, a set of ancient Greek prophecies. And fourth, the Fetials, the final set of priests connected to war and diplomacy. Other colleges would appear later, but these were the four main ones connected to Roman religious life. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, why are we talking about priestly colleges? Well, let's just say that the Venn diagram of senators and priests is pretty overlapping. Many of the priests were senators, though not all senators were priests. Senators became priests by appointment, and in the imperial era, by the emperor's appointment. The priesthood was a lifelong appointment, and slots were limited. This caused Augustus to open a new college of priests just to satisfy positions for senators in priesthoods. There really were very few limits as to the relationship between the priesthoods and the Senate. The only priests with significant limits were the pontiffs flamens, due to the individuality their priests were afforded compared to other colleges. Flamens were not allowed to become magistrates until later during the empire, and they were allowed a very limited time away from the city of Rome or from their own bed, depending on the suborder of the priesthood. This was not good if you lived or had duties outside of the capital. The other priest that was completely barred from any political duty was the Sacred King. The Sacred King was part of the College of Pontiffs, and he inherited the religious duties of the ancient kings. It's not hard to imagine why he was barred for duty, considering Rome's trauma about the regal days. The emperors quickly learned that the priestly colleges were a good way to keep senatorial friends happy, enemies flattered, and generally exercise power. In the empire, it was the emperors who could appoint priestly positions. Regardless of empire or republic, the priests of the Pontifex College were the ones who put forward religious laws, and it was up to the Senate to approve them, making their relationship quite symbiotic. Senators were so used to witnessing the priests in action that for certain priesthoods, like augurs, the learning process can be quite easy since they witnessed the priests in action for many years as a senator. The augurs inaugurated the Senate House as a templum, a sacred space. Women were barred from the position of senator, as they were of most priesthoods except for one famous exception: the position of Vestal Virgins. Even the Vestal Virgins were linked to the Senate. While only young girls could become Vestal Virgins, these girls were often drawn from the senatorial class and had senators as family members. While some senators did not want their daughters to become Vestal Virgins, others competed with each other to have the emperor appoint their daughters. During the Republic, the Vestal Virgins were dedicated to the goddess of the hearth. During the Empire, they shifted their duties to the devotions of the emperor and his family, while still maintaining their connection to the hearth, connecting the emperor directly to the heart of the Roman household, regardless of class. If you were an ambitious senator, having your daughter be a priestess of the emperor and the hearth was a very good thing. Obviously, this is generally very different from how our modern senates or legislative bodies run or interact with religion. So, were the Romans themselves alarmed about the concentration of power in such a small group of people like the priests and the senators? Well, considering that the Senate, at its most powerful, was drawn from the patrician and equestrian classes and sought to concentrate power on them, well, they had little regard for what the plebeians thought. In theory, the magistrate was supposed to represent the will of the plebeians, but the Senate fortified itself over the centuries. The concentration of power is what we'd today call a feature, not a bug. As Cicero put it, worship of the gods and the highest interests of the state were in the hands of the same men. And, well, that was how they liked it. So, where did our ancient template for modern legislative systems go wrong? Well, before the emperors, it was powerful men like Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar who began to undermine the Senate. Men like these two set the stage for what was to come later. Now, it's important to note that the emperors were not kings during the Principate period. They were the high priests, gods, and had king-like power, but they had to perform a delicate dance. The Senate wasn't so much the partner they danced with, but rather the dance floor. This is as it was during the Principate, the period when the emperors were shrouded in layers of laws, rituals, and anything they could do to not be portrayed as kings. They pretended to share power while concentrating that power on themselves. The Senate had a huge part to play in this. They allowed the empire to happen and even hailed Octavian as the savior of the Roman Republic. The Senate made the position of emperor by a complex stacking of religious, civil, and military titles upon him. Over the years, the emperors better reshaped the Senate to bend to their wills. This started, in a way, before the emperors, under dictators like Julius Caesar, who ballooned the Senate to 1,000 members. Octavian trimmed that number down to around 600. Octavian and Julius before him both literally reshaped the Senate to suit them, but Octavian's reforms kept that figure 600 relatively stable. He also put forth morality clauses, wealth clauses, and other limiting factors that saw who could become and remain a senator change starting in 18 BCE. That said, perhaps as a power play, he helped members who didn't meet certain requirements become senators, even if it went against his own requirements. Very crafty and in line with Augustus Caesar's personality and method of politics. Augustus also created the formal senatorial class. New senators were given their position for life, as well as for 2 generations of their families, a son and a grandson. This new senatorial class meant that the emperors could shape several generations down the line into a new class of politicians that were loyal to them. Old patrician families could continue if they showed loyalty, but this opened the door to new members, patrician, equestrian, or plebeians, as long as they met the requirements or could show the right appreciation for an emperor who waived their requirements. This led to an interesting consequence that helped give the empire an increasingly cosmopolitan reorientation. Even under the Republic, Rome expanded far beyond the borders of the city and Italy, yet power was concentrated in the Senate from the city itself. In some ways, this would continue in the beginning of the empire. With the creation of the new senatorial class, it allowed senators to come from outside the eternal city and from the new territories the empire had expanded into. Eventually, the emperors themselves would come from outside the city of Rome and Italy altogether, but it was the Senate that began to show this cosmopolitan side of the empire. Despite how much weaker the Senate was during the empire, that statement comes with a huge asterisk. During the Principate period, all emperors were senators before donning the purple. But besides this, how exactly was it weakened under the emperors? Before Augustus, many of the procedures and duties of the Senate were not enshrined in writing, but were more unwritten customs. Augustus pounced on that weakness to reshape what the Senate really meant. He did not radically change procedures, but enshrined several aspects of the emperorship and its role in the Senate. Essentially, in theory, the emperor was a patrician senator. In practice, senators knew they could not openly refuse an emperor's request. Almost instantly, the Senate became a sham when it came to matters of interest to the emperor. He could not be openly defied. That said, the point of the Principate was, in a way, to pretend that Rome was still a republic, and that meant showing respect to the Senate as an institution of the republic. As long as the Senate stood and appeared to retain its authority, it was business as usual. So, what happened to the Senate in the later days of the empire? Well, it never really went away until the Byzantine Empire did. Emperor Constantine established a second Senate in Constantinople. In the later empire, when the capital was moved there, the Senate took up a different role and was essentially a different body. Senators were brought up through the system of administrative bureaucracy the later empire was known for. It was more of an advisory body for the emperor. The Senate played a role in choosing a new emperor along with the army, or in deposing emperors, but it was a very different Senate than that of the Republican early empire. A notable difference, often not discussed, is the shedding of its older religious role. By this point, Rome was Christian, and regardless of church, Christianity functioned very differently from the ancient Roman religion. It didn't have priestly colleges or a senate, and neither did the priests of the church have the power to radically change their religion the way the Roman priestly colleges and senate could. The Christians themselves placed limits between church and state as a reaction to the marriage of both under Rome. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and render unto God what belongs to God. The Senate passed into a purely political and administrative body. The Byzantine Senate continued in this different form and played its role in the history of the later Roman Empire, helping to place and depose emperors until its dissolution at the end of the empire. Looking back from a modern lens, it isn't easy to say that the Senate is good or evil. Passing moral judgments on ancient institutions is not something that's inherently useful, but since we inherited this model of government, at least on the surface, it is important to evaluate its history. The Roman Senate ultimately did not live up to its own purpose. In the height of the Republic, the senators maintained control over the lower classes and grew rich and fat off constant wars and expansion. As it grew, it started to prepare the way for its own decline. First, it paved the way for the return of the autocracy. It feared so under the kings. It used its immense power to support the return of an autocratic figure in the emperor until the emperors stripped the Senate of its free will and subjugated it. Finally, any religious significance of the Senate was stripped by the time Rome was Christianized, making it even more of a shell of its original intent. That said, was it all bad? Well, the Senate started to reflect the cosmopolitan nature of the empire under successive emperors. While the Senate died in the West, in the East it continued as a sort of system of checks and balances on the emperors. Its secularization under Christianity and its gradual weakening under the empire set it up as the ancestor of our modern form of government. Was it all bad? No. And like all history, it is best learned from and studied, especially as in this case what the Roman Senate really was and what we so often think of it as today. Zeus and Jupiter, just faces of the same coin. What about Venus and Aphrodite? When we think of ancient Roman mythology, oftentimes we're really thinking about Greek mythology without knowing it. The line between Rome and Greece is sometimes clear. For example, Romans spoke Latin, Greeks spoke Greek, simple and clean. Other times, that line is incredibly blurred. Case in point, Roman religion is something that has been so obscured that without knowing it, many assume Roman and Greek gods are one and the same, just with different names. In addition, we know that Rome expanded well beyond the city's borders into one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. This meant that it encompassed cultures very different from the simple Latin farmers that settled the ancient city. What about the gods of these foreign cultures? How did the various religions so important to their societies mesh together, and Rome so seamlessly handle this aspect of such a large and diverse civilization? Right off the bat, the Romans themselves will admit a great religious debt to their neighbors, the Greeks and the Etruscans. The Greeks maintained colonies around the earliest territory of Rome called Magna Graecia in South Italy and Sicily from the 8th century BCE. The Etruscans came from north of Rome in an area called Etruria, and their last cities were absorbed by Rome in 27 BCE. Both societies exerted a great influence on Rome that affected not just what gods the Romans worshipped, but how they worshipped them, including rituals, theology, and even the myths themselves. This is not to say that Romans did not have their own relatively native gods, or that the Roman religion is just a pastiche. While the Roman gods share parallels with the Etruscan and Greek gods such as Jupiter, who functioned even then as Rome's chief god, Rome had its own gods such as the two-faced Janus and Flora, the god of nature. Roman religion was built on a foundation of priestly officers that acted as gatekeepers for what is and isn't Roman religion. By priests, we don't mean professional priests who had only one job. Usually they held offices tied to politics, mercantile business, or served in the military. These officers were organized into colleges such as augurs, who could read signs from the gods, all the way to pontifices, who had control over the calendar and could dispense law. Roman religion also had a fixation on rituals, with the belief that incorrectly performed rituals could result in occasional terrible consequences. This opens up the question: if Romans were so obsessed with ritual, wouldn't that make it harder to keep incorporating foreign gods into their own system? The answer is actually no, because the Romans believed in local gods, or genius loci, spirits of the place. Every place had a god, and it was important for Romans to identify a place's god and apply worship and rituals. For example, Greek rites were recognized separately from native Roman rites, and the priests even dressed differently for them. Beyond concrete Olympian or early gods in the 3rd century BCE, the Romans also began to worship personifications of abstract concepts. For example, they worshipped a personification of Rome itself called Roma. They also worshipped Concord, faith, honor, hope, and victory, who we also know by the later Greek name Nike. It's even thought that Venus originally started as a personification before she became associated with the Olympian Aphrodite. This worship of personifications shows how flexible the Roman religion could be. Internal developments were accepted with outside additions as Rome expanded. The colleges always handled the incorporation of foreign gods, and their cults were permitted. One college of priests was quite unique: the Board of 15 for Ritual Action. Among other things, they had a responsibility unlike any of the other colleges: consulting the Sibylline Books, a mysterious collection of Greek prophetic poems. Oftentimes, when Rome faced a crisis, the books were turned to find an answer. It was the job of these priests to consult the Sibylline Book, and sometimes the resulting consultation was the adoption of a foreign god or cult. The most famous of these Sibylline adoptions was during the Second Punic War, when, after a consultation with the books, a delegation was sent to Pergamon to transfer an image of the Anatolian mother goddess Cybele to Rome. Cybele's cult was associated at first with victory and later with Magna Mater, the mother deity of Rome. There seemed to be no clash between this foreign god and native gods, showing that, as far as we know, Roman adoption of foreign gods had a large measure of acceptance. As the Republic expanded, it incorporated new peoples and locales. In some cases, incorporating new peoples, cults and gods became easy, such as with the Greeks. Other times, relations were tense, or tense in nuanced ways. Egyptians are a good example of possible tensions that developed as foreign cults came up against Roman religion. Egyptian gods had already made their way into the Hellenic world before Rome incorporated Egypt into its empire. Isis was being worshipped in Rome in the 1st century BCE in an initiatory mystery cult that was unusual, and was usually in a triad with her husband Osiris and son Horus. A temple was even built for Isis around 43 BCE in the city of Rome. However, even though figures like Isis, Osiris, and Horus were worshipped by Romans in their own cults, this wasn't always evidence of fully peaceful coexistence. For example, Egypt rebelled against Rome in 172 CE on religious grounds, appealing to a Hellenized form of Osiris called the Alexandrian Serapis. There's another example: the Jews suffered under the Romans, most infamously the Roman occupation of Jewish lands and the destruction of the Second Temple. However, while the Jews saw their share of oppression under the Romans, for the most part, they were exempt from taking part in Roman religion in a way that ultimately would not be afforded to later Christians. But the Romans, the Jews, had an ancestral religion, and so they were exempt from emperor worship or worshipping the Roman gods. That said, this did not stop serious persecution. There were flare-ups across Roman history, and Jewish philosophers like Philo and Josephus turned to Hellenic philosophy to write about their own religion. These writings outlived the Roman Empire and played an important part in the development of Christian and Jewish theology, influencing how scholars of those religions talked about a god that was technically one of many gods that Romans worshipped. worshipped. Arguably a more important religious change associated with Rome going imperial was the worship of the emperors. How did a people who lived in fear of being ruled by a king go from republic to having an emperor to emperor worship? Well, Romans did worship leaders, but it was not a widespread practice until the Republic began to expand. An example of this is Titus Quintius Flaminius, who led the decisive battle of the Second Macedonian War, capturing Greece for Rome in 197 BCE. Further transitional figures between the Republic and the Empire had their own cults like Pompey, Mark Antony, and most importantly to the establishment of the imperial cult, Julius Caesar. Moving on from there, although never an emperor, Julius Caesar was deified by the Senate. After Caesar, emperors were also deified by the Senate upon their deaths. On top of that, the living emperor and his family were also ultimately worshipped. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it was Augustus himself who was the one to solidify emperor worship, walking the tightrope of worshipping an autocratic ruler who is king in all but name, with the political power provided by being worshipped as a living god. On the latter, Augustus being worshipped as a god was not something that would look good for his position. Thus, what was worshipped instead was the noumen, or the spiritual power of the emperor. To smooth over the delicate boundary between king and emperor, emperor worship was first tied to the Roma cult, which worshipped the personification of Rome. Over time, as the concept of emperor set in and became accepted as a permanent fixture of Rome, and the emperors themselves became worshipped rather than the power they possessed or their association with Roma. Over time, as the concept of emperor set in and became accepted as a permanent fixture of Rome, and the emperors themselves became worshipped rather than the power they possessed or their association with Roma. The cult ultimately became integral to state religion. Worshipping the emperor proved Roman loyalty. The rituals, festivals, and celebrations tied the people to the emperor and increased his power. Roman citizens and provincials were allowed to worship other gods as long as the emperor was worshipped as well. This is why we see in native temples in Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia statues of the Roman emperors in temples built during Roman times. This would play a large part of why Christians were persecuted, as they refused to worship the emperor and thus did not show loyalty to Rome. As noted, while Jews sometimes were forced to reckon with emperor worship, for the most part, they were excused on the grounds that their religion was ancestral, whereas the Christian religion was not. And speaking of Christianity, in the 2nd century, mystery religions started taking on a life of their own as well, taking a more individual approach rather than the communal Roman religions. There were initiation ceremonies, purification rituals, and a much smaller group setting. Eastern religions such as Mithraism and the cult of Sol Invictus came from Persia and Syria respectively. Mithraism is particularly interesting because it was a take on the Zoroastrianism of Rome's perennial enemy, Persia. Persia and Rome would be at war and suffer strained relations until the Arab conquest of the Sassanid Empire in 651 CE. Despite this, these religions had a large impact on Roman religion. Mithras was the legendary hero sent by the god of light Ahura Mazda to slay a mythical bull. When Mithras slew the bull, his blood covered the earth and gave rise to the natural world and all living things. Mithras was identified with the sun, which gave it a connection to the other major mystery cult, the cult of Sol Invictus. While Sol had been worshipped in early Rome as a solar deity, often paired with the Greek Apollo or Roman Helios, Sol Invictus was a Syrian solar deity imported to Rome and popularized by the emperor Elagabalus during his reign in 218 to 222 CE. Elagabalus was its priest as a boy, and he tried and failed to make Sol Invictus the chief deity of Rome. Later, Aurelian in 274 succeeded where Elagabalus had failed, and Sol Invictus became the supreme Roman deity. So what made these cults so different from native Roman cults? Aside from the shifting focus and style of rituals, the practitioners of these cults were henotheistic. That meant that they recognized that other gods existed but worshipped Mithras or Sol Invictus almost exclusively. The worshippers were usually soldiers, merchants, and other elites. The cults were an important step to Christianity's formation, as Christianity was influenced by their structure and rituals. Christianity itself was considered a competing mystery cult. Of course, as alluded to, unlike those mystery cults, Christianity would not recognize the existence of gods other than the Christian god, and unsurprisingly, from this forbade the worship of the emperor, who the other mystery cults were always willing to worship. The result of this, as alluded to, was widespread and extremely brutal persecution of Christians for quite some time in the Roman Empire. Moving on from there, going the other way, with other cultures absorbing Roman gods, while some foreign gods like Isis, Cybele, and Sol Invictus made their way to the city of Rome and were adopted by Romans throughout the empire, others stayed local. However, these deities that stayed local often fused with Roman deities, or more aptly, Lastly, it seems to have been a matter of identifying a certain type of god with its native equivalent. Take, for example, Mars, the Roman god of war. In Britain, there were many gods of war, and they often took the name of Mars for that reason. This is the case with Celtic war gods like Mars Albiorix, who was both a war god and a mountain god, and Mars Condatis, who was both a war god and a river god. The conquered people brought in the Roman gods and fused them with their own so they could fit in with the core of the empire. That said, in most cases, it is unclear if these combinations are separate gods in their own sense, a different god altogether, or an aspect of the foreign or Roman god. In some cases, gods will appear once or a handful of times in sources like inscriptions, or with no elaboration. The lack of documentation for a vast majority of these gods leaves us with a lot of questions about their nature and how Romans themselves saw them. In some cases, you'll even find gods that are amalgamations of a Roman god, a foreign god, and an emperor. This is the case with Mars Lucetius Augustus, a combination of Mars, a Celtic thunder god, Lucetius, and the Emperor Augustus. Given how widespread religious worship was, you might be surprised at the lack of hard documentation in many cases. The reason we don't have much information about Roman religions is simply that they were all replaced by one of the most persecuted in Rome, Christianity, which ultimately endured the extreme onslaught and replaced all the old religions over the later periods of Rome. On that note, it is technically fair to call the Christian god a Roman god, as he did indeed become the chief god of Rome. It should also be noted that discourse about the Christian god was bolstered by philosophy, a hallmark of Hellenic civilization. Greek philosophers particularly put forth theories of a supreme deity that sometimes got identified with the Greek gods. Through translation and Greek studies, the Platonists, Stoics, and Epicureans took over philosophical discourse in Rome. The philosophers had their own discussion of gods and supreme beings. When Christianity began to overtake the Roman religion, the philosophies moved once again in a different direction. Plotinus, who died in 270 CE, gave Romans a way to talk about their gods philosophically to counter the growing Christian intellectual presence. This philosophy was elaborated on by future Platonists following Plotinus. These philosophers also worked out their own defenses of Roman rituals, theologies of the Olympic gods, and wrote polemics against Christians. At the time, Greek epics such as Homer and Hesiod's poetry became a Roman Bible of sorts, with the philosophers developing a relationship with them similar to the ones their Christian rivals had to the Bible. This literature was only among the elites, so it is unknown how much it filtered into Roman society. But one major consequence of Roman philosophers turning to Greek works by Homer and Hesiod is that the Roman gods became more tied to the Olympian Greek gods. It should also be noted from all of this that we got a lot of our knowledge of Roman religion from the Church Fathers' writings. Since Church Fathers were at an ideological war with philosophers, we thus likely have an exaggerated view of how Greek Roman religion was. In the end, any gods the Romans worshipped became a Roman god. This is true for emperors, foreign gods, and even the Christian gods that eventually replaced all of them. The Olympian gods of the Greeks were not even necessarily the gods of Rome, but they also were, and the situation gets more confusing the more you find out. When one thinks of Roman emperors, often two kinds come to mind: the heroic generals and the brilliant philosophers like Caesar Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, or the insane and depraved despots like Nero and Commodus. The latter two are well known for their long list of antics. For a video on Nero's famous Fiddle incident and the truth about that, check out the link in the description below. We've done a video about that. But both Nero and Commodus were both preceded by an emperor who, in his 3 years and 10 months as ruler in Rome, acted in a manner that at first was bizarre and then descended into outright insanity. Born Gaius Julius Augustus Germanicus, the man better known as Caligula was the great-grandson of the Caesar Augustus, son of General Germanicus Julius Caesar, and the third man to assume the title of Roman emperor. During his early childhood, he would travel with his father, Germanicus, on his military campaigns, dressed in a little soldier's outfit. The soldiers took great humor in this and nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boot. When he was around 7 years old, his father was killed in Syria, possibly poisoned by an agent of his great-uncle, the Emperor Tiberius, who saw his nephew as a potential political rival. After this, the young Caligula spent time in the care of his mother until she and his brother Nero were exiled to the island of Pandateria for treason. From then on, he lived with his great-grandmother Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus, and then his grandmother Antonia Minor. While in exile, his brother and mother were abused and malnourished, leading to their deaths in 31 and 33 AD. Unsurprisingly, Unsurprisingly, from this, their deaths caused Caligula to harbour a rather large amount of resentment towards Tiberius. No surprises there. Caligula was relocated to the islands of Capria, a popular resort island off the west coast of Italy. Here, he was under the watchful eye of his great uncle, but with some manoeuvring and acting skill, he managed to avoid banishment or execution. For example, he ingratiated himself with Naevius Sartorius Macro, the head of Tiberius's guard, who would often speak well of Caligula on his behalf. Ultimately, he was given an honorary quaestorship, an important political office, and briefly married in 33 AD, but his wife, Junia Claudia, died in childbirth shortly after. 2 years later, in 35 AD, Caligula and his cousin Tiberius Gemellus were named coheirs to emperor. A mere 2 years after that, Emperor Tiberius died in March of 37 AD, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it was rumoured that Caligula, or possibly the aforementioned Macro, may have hastened his death. As for Macro, Roman historian Tacitus claims he smothered the 77-year-old emperor with a pillow, while Suetonius alleges Caligula did the deed himself. Whatever the truth of that, after the emperor's death, Caligula and Macro successfully removed Gemellus from Tiberius's will, and he then held sole claim to the principate. He was inaugurated by the Senate later that month and was heralded by the Roman people with immense celebration. The first 7 months of his rule were rather joyful by all accounts. Ingratiating himself to the masses, he relieved citizens overburdened by imperial taxation, recalled political exiles, and funded many public spectacles. For his own part, he also retrieved the remains of his mother and brothers and ensured that they received a proper place of honor. But in October of his first year as emperor, something changed. Caligula fell ill. Some historians suggest that he may have been poisoned, while others assert it was nothing more than a simple common illness. But either way, something changed directly thereafter, at least if his behavior is any indication. Not long after, he began executing members of his family, including his cousin Gemellus, as well as his father-in-law and brother-in-law. His 2 younger sisters were exiled, and only his uncle Claudius, the future 4th emperor and Caligula's replacement, was spared, simply to be kept around as an object for ridicule and amusement. Further, Caligula began to slander the memory of Emperor Augustus and stated that his own mother had actually been the result of an incestuous relationship from Augustus with his daughter. Over the next 3 years, Caligula's reign would become more and more erratic. At first, he pushed for tax reforms to relieve an overburdened populace and promoted several plebeians to the more esteemed equestrian rank. This ingratiated him with the common people, but it drew the ire of the Roman elite. Beyond this, he conducted numerous building projects, including the expansion of ports on the Toe of Italia and Circus to allow for more grain imports. He completed the temple of his great-grandfather, the now deified Caesar Augustus, as well as the theatre of Pompeii. He began construction of 2 major aqueducts to better distribute water to the city, and went so far as hauling an obelisk all the way from Egypt to use as a centerpiece in the circus he had built. The obelisk is actually still around today and is prominently displayed near the Vatican in Rome. Early in his reign, he also completed perhaps the most insane of his building projects, a giant pontoon bridge across the Bay of Baiae in southern Italy. He did this just to ride his favorite horse into Tartus across the bay and fulfill a mock prophecy, saying he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. Speaking of the horse, he also apparently attempted to make this horse consul and built the horse a stable out of marble, a manager from ivory, and filled the horse's not-so-humble abode with the finest purple trappings. Caligula also designated a house fully furnished and filled with attendant slaves for dinner parties held by this horse on occasion. Unfortunately for the humor of it all, he was unsuccessful in making Incitatus a consul. However, he did manage to make him a priest. Moving on from there, according to Roman historians, Caligula began to refer to himself as Pater Exercitum, the father of the armies, and Optimus Maximus Caesar, the best and greatest Caesar. He supposedly also had an incestuous relationship with his sister Drusilla and kept her with him even after she married. Upon her death, he ordered a period of public mourning over her. He later incorporated the temple devoted to the twin deities Castor and Pollux into his own palace. Continuing his trend of rather odd and seemingly dangerous behavior, attempting to stir up unrest between the commoners and the social elite, he would sell seats to plebeians so that when equestrians showed up to plays, all their seats would already be taken. Naturally, this didn't sit well with them. Further, during public spectacles, the emperor would withdraw the shade curtains from the top of the amphitheater when the sun was hottest and forbid anyone from leaving, then only provided wounded or sickly beasts and aged gladiators to fight for their entertainment. He would on occasion also close the granaries so that the people could starve for a bit. Apparently, having a bucket list life goal to piss off as many people as humanly possible, Caligula also began to execute accused criminals without hearing their cases, going so far as to compel parents to be present at their children's executions. One man, saying he was unwell and unable to attend one such execution, was met with Caligula's personal litter, who was sent to fetch him. And once, when he heard an equestrian crying out that he was innocent in the arena, Caligula had the man brought to him, cut out his tongue, and tossed him back in. He also fed prisoners to the wild beasts he reserved for his games, whether they were actually guilty of whatever crime or not, just didn't seem to be a concern. Keeping up the crazy, Caligula also in one instance apparently asked a man whom he'd brought back from exile how he spent his time away from home. Fearing for his own life, the man replied carefully, "I prayed to the gods that Tiberius would die and you should become emperor." Hearing this, Caligula promptly dispatched word that anyone he had banished must now be executed. But Caligula's mistreatment of others did not end with the poor or his political rivals. He often forced his officials to run alongside his litter wearing full togas, a heavy wool garment which is perhaps not best suited for sport. Then they would have to attend to him at dinner distributing napkins. In one specific instance, it's also noted that while training, the veteran gladiator with whom Caligula practiced his martial skills purposefully threw himself at the emperor's feet in defeat. Rather than simply end the training session as you might expect, Caligula stabbed him to death and ran about with the palm frond, the traditional signal of victory shown by gladiators, as if he'd just been in a real gladiatorial fight. Reversing his early efforts to ingratiate the masses, he ultimately began taxing the Roman people heavily, even arresting wealthy citizens and confiscating their property, and he once demanded gifts to be given to him on New Year's Day from every single person in Rome. Then, once he'd received his gifts, apparently he just for the fun of it rolled around in massive piles of gold coins that he'd accumulated from the haul. Beyond day-to-day management of the empire, Roman emperors were often marked by their military campaigns, but Caligula was a tad different here too. He only went on a single military campaign during his tenure as emperor. Wishing to conquer Britain, he assembled a vast army and made way. At times, he would have the army move at such haste that he and his elite personal guard had to stow their standard to keep up, and at others so slowly that he could order the towns ahead to sweep the roads and wet them down to settle the dust. Encountering no resistance along the way, he ordered some Germanic members of his guard to cross the Rhine and lie in wait. During his evening meal, he ordered a messenger to inform him that the enemy was advancing, then quickly captured the men and announced his great victory. When he reached the northwestern coast of Gaul, modern France, he declared war against Neptune himself. His soldiers were directed to stab the sea and collect seashells as war trophies. Then, gathering the best and tallest Gaulish men he could find, he ordered them to dye their hair blonde and assume German names so they could pretend to be prisoners of war upon his return to Rome. Continuing the crazy, as his reign continued, he began to dress up as several gods, often bearing the tokens usually associated with them, such as a lightning bolt trident or caduceus. He is also described as affixing a golden beard to his face, wearing women's shoes, or dressing in the habit of Venus. He also began referring to himself as Jupiter on public documents. At one point, he even ordered all the statues of deities be brought from Greece so that he could replace their heads with his own. This included the sixth wonder of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia. Not limiting himself to the Greek or Roman gods, frustrated and mistrustful of the Hebrews for their stubborn displays of monotheism, Caligula attempted to have his statue erected in the Temple of Jerusalem. As you might expect, fearing a revolt, the governor of Syria delayed completing the order by almost a year. After advisors finally convinced him to reverse the order, Caligula quickly changed his mind, renamed the temple of the illustrious Gaius the New Jupiter, and built a colossal bronze gilt statue of himself to place within. As you might imagine from all of this, pissing off basically every person in his empire, and more than a few beyond, couldn't last forever. Finally, the senators grew tired of his antics. 3 men, led by an individual named Cassius Chaerea, began plotting to assassinate him. As for Chaerea's specific beef with the emperor, Caligula seems to have enjoyed making powerful people kiss his ring while he extended his middle finger at them. Yes, people have been flipping off others for thousands of years, with the original implication seeming to represent the penis, as we've covered before on the origin of giving people the bird. In any event, on a no doubt completely unrelated note to this, as mentioned, the chief organizer of Caligula's assassination and first to stab him was Cassius Chaerea, who Caligula liked to do this very thing to, as noted by Suetonius. Gaius used to taunt him, a man already well on in years, with voluptuousness and effeminacy by every every form of insult. When he asked for the watchword, Gaius would give him Priapus or Venus, and when Correa had occasion to thank him for anything, he would hold out his hand to kiss, forming and moving it in an obscene fashion. In any event, the conspirators' plans were forced into motion when Caligula stated that he planned to move to the Egyptian city of Alexandria to be worshipped there as a living god. And so it was that they, along with many other conspirators, cornered the emperor in an underground tunnel beneath the palace and gave him the old Caesarean treatment. It is reported that he made no sound of alarm when the assassins struck and only attempted to flee out of the tunnels as he was stabbed to death. After, members of the guard went on a bloody rampage, killing several of the conspirators, as well as nearby senators who were uninvolved in the assassination. The emperor's body was half burned on a hastily assembled pyre and buried on the spot. His wife and daughter were murdered along with him. Rumor has it the garden in which the emperor was burned and buried became haunted by spiritual apparitions until Caligula's sisters, having returned from exile, finished the cremation and gave him a proper burial. With his death, the Roman Empire saw the end of the Julian Caesars. As to why he acted so bizarrely during his rule, this is a matter of debate. It is noted that during his life, Caligula often complained that the times he lived in were relatively peaceful, unmarked by famine, war, or natural disasters, and thus he feared he may pass from memory if he was not associated with any noteworthy event. This may have led him to become so obsessed with putting on military shows, promoting himself as the very incarnation of several deities, and the constant self-promotion through trying to assert his image onto every statue in the empire, obsessed with being remembered as his forebears were. Whether or not that was his motivation or not, in the end, the man himself is indeed one of the most remembered of Roman emperors, though, of course, remembered not for any great achievements or with any reverence, but simply for his insane behavior and for establishing a precedent for instability that would follow, though never quite be equaled, by emperors to come.
When Julius Caesar's father died suddenly when Caesar was 16, it put him in charge of the family. Around 17, he had also been appointed the high priest of Jupiter, though was later stripped of this position when Sulla, Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, became dictator of Rome. Caesar then fled Rome, but ultimately got in the good graces of Sulla, though thanks to his mother's family, and then returned and joined the military so as to skip town just in case Sulla changed his mind. When Sulla resigned as dictator in 79 BC and died the following year, Caesar resigned from the military and returned to Rome, where he made a name for himself as a legal advocate and great public speaker, despite his high-pitched voice. This brings us to 75 BC, when a 25-year-old Julius Caesar was sailing the Aegean Sea when he was kidnapped by pirates. The pirates who captured him then asked for a ransom of 20 talents of silver, which is about 620 kilograms of silver, or $400,000 of silver by today's silver prices. According to Plutarch, rather than send off his associates to gather the silver, Caesar instead berated the pirates and demanded that they ask for 50 talents of silver, 1,550 kilograms, as 20 talents was too small of a ransom for someone as notable as himself. In truth, Caesar at this point was just a private citizen, but he was from a very prominent and well-connected family. The pirates, of course, agreed, and Caesar sent off some of his associates to gather the silver, which took 38 days to accomplish. Now nearly alone with the pirates, only keeping 2 servants and one of his friends, rather than cower, he instead took the route of treating them as if they were his subordinates. He even reportedly went so far as to demand they not talk whenever he decided to take a nap or go to sleep for the night. He spent most of his time with them composing and reciting poetry, as well as writing speeches. He would then recite the works to the pirates. At other times, he joined in with playing various games with them and participating in their exercises, generally acting as if he wasn't a prisoner, but rather their leader. The pirates supposedly grew to respect and like him and allowed him the freedom to more or less do as he pleased on the island and their ships. That said, while he was friendly with the pirates, he also didn't appreciate being held captive. As such, he swore to them that he'd hunt them down and have them crucified once the ransom was paid and he was released. True to his word, once he was free, he managed to quickly raise a small fleet, which he took back to the islands the pirates had held him at. Apparently, they hadn't taken his threat seriously because they were still around when he arrived. He thus captured them, took back his 50 talents of silver, along with all of their possessions. He next delivered the pirates to the authorities at the prison at Pergamon, and then traveled to meet the proconsul of Asia, Marcus Junius, to petition to have the pirates executed. The proconsul refused, wanting to sell the pirates as slaves and take the spoils for himself. Unhappy with this outcome, Caesar traveled back to Pergamon, where the pirates were being held, and ordered that they be crucified under his own authority, which was subsequently done, though as a slight act of mercy he did have their throats cut before they were crucified, which, while still ended up with them being dead, was at least a much less painful and drastically quicker way to die. Not long after this, he was called back to the military, where he started to make a name for himself, eventually culminating in his famous crossing of the Rubicon, changing the world forever. That said, funnily enough, given how much of world history after hinged on this one act, up until very recently, nobody actually knew where the Rubicon was that he had crossed, which now leads us into today's bonus fact. On January the 10th, 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with a legion of his soldiers, which was against Roman law. Specifically, governors of Roman provinces, pro-magistrates, were not allowed to bring any part of their army within Italy itself, and if they tried, they automatically forfeited their right to rule, even in their own province. The only ones who were allowed to command soldiers in Italy were consuls or praetors. The act of leading his troops into Italy would have meant Caesar's execution and the execution of any soldier who followed him had he failed in his conquest. So, why did he do it? Caesar was ordered to return to Rome as his term as governor was up, and he was ordered to disband his army as well. The problem was that with some of his political enemies in prominent positions, Caesar was not too keen on returning to Rome without an army at his back or the immunity granted to magistrates. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar wasn't at first sure whether he'd bring his soldiers with him or come quietly, in terms of which thing was more risky. But he ultimately made the decision his survival would be most likely if he marched into Rome with some soldiers at his back. This brings us to the fact that despite the Rubicon once signifying the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper, the exact location of this river was lost to history until quite recently. The river's location was initially lost primarily because it was a very small river of no major size or importance other than as a convenient border landmark. Thus, when Augustus merged the northern province of Cisalpine Gaul into Italy proper, it ceased to be a border, and which river it was exactly gradually faded from history. Thanks to occasional flooding of the region until around the 14th or 15th centuries, the course of the river also frequently changed, with very little of it thought to follow its original course, excepting the upper regions. In the 14th and 15th century, various mechanisms were put in place to prevent flooding and to regulate somewhat the paths of many rivers in that region to accommodate agricultural endeavors. The flooding and eventual regulation of the river's paths further made it difficult to decipher which river was actually the Rubicon and where exactly the historic crossing took place. Various rivers were proposed as candidates, but the correct theory wasn't proposed until 1933, namely what is now called the Fiumicino, with the crossing likely being somewhere around the present-day industrial town of Savignano sul Rubicone, which you might think would be a dead giveaway as to the location, but it should be noted here that before 1991 it was called Savignano di Romagna. So, what happened in 1991? Scholars, using various historical texts, managed to triangulate the exact distance from Rome to the Rubicon at 199 miles, that's 320 kilometers. Following Roman roads of the day and other evidence, they then were able to deduce where exactly the original Rubicon had been and which river today was once the Rubicon. And do note that the river that's there today is about 1 mile away from where the Rubicon used to flow.
While dropping your drawers and flashing your no doubt abnormally attractive derriere at those you wish to express your contempt for may seem a relatively harmless act, it turns out at one point in history, combining said act with expelling the gaseous contents of one colon resulted in the deaths of at least 10,000 humans, in what we here at Today Found Out are confident can be described as history's deadliest fart. So what happened here, and how did the practice of mooning people begin and spread its cheeks the world over? Well, unbutton those pants, strap on, let's take an exceptionally deep dive all up in this one, shall we? Our story begins with the 1st century Roman Jewish historian and military leader Flavius Josephus. The son of a Jewish priest, Matthias, Josephus spent his formative years on the Jewish side of the Jewish-Roman conflict, ultimately the head of the Jewish forces in Galilee. However, in 67 AD, after a 6-week siege of Yodfat, Josephus' siding with the Jews came to an abrupt end. While exactly what happened is up for debate, given Josephus' own account is primarily what we have to work with, on the 47th day, the Romans took the town and Josephus himself himself and a few dozen others took refuge in some caves. Rather than be captured, they decided it was better to die, but owing to suicide being a sin, they drew lots to see who should kill and commenced with this mutual slaughter. In the end, the final survivors came down to Josephus and one other man, who decided that rather than kill one another, they thought maybe it's better that we surrender after all. Upon doing so, Josephus ingratiated himself upon the head of the Roman forces, Vespasian, by prophesying that Vespasian would become emperor of Rome. And so it was that rather than kill Josephus, Vespasian decided to take him as a slave. 2 years later, Josephus was freed when Vespasian became emperor and was granted Roman citizenship and more or less completely cast his lot on with the Roman side of things, including serving as advisor and translator to Vespasian's son Titus during the 70 AD siege of Jerusalem. Of course, Josephus isn't really remembered today for any of these exploits, but rather primarily for his highly influential work, The Jewish War, which among other things is considered one of the best sources for information about this pivotal period of Jewish history that ultimately saw their temple destroyed and their people displaced and their lands confiscated for Roman use. It also functioned as a significant work in the early days of Christianity, given its description of events surrounding the era that comprised the life of Jesus of Nazareth, including accounts of prominent biblical figures such as Herod the Great, John the Baptist, and Pontius Pilate. Noteworthy in his efforts in all of this was to give an account that was impartial, unlike so many others of the era. As Josephus noted of those covering the same events, they have a mind to demonstrate the greatness of the Romans while they still diminish and lessen the actions of the Jews. While given his Jewish heritage, you might think he'd be inclined to colour things more in their favour instead. But Josephus himself noted his goal was to be impartial and that he would not go to the other extreme and will prosecute the actions of both parties with accuracy, something, for the most part, historians generally agree that he did. In the end, the Jewish-Roman Wars changed history and the Jewish religion in some rather significant ways, including on the latter, shifting from the temple and high priest-centered worship to synagogue and rabbi-centric. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. So, well, let's get back to the important stuff of what all of this has to do with exposing your backside for fun and profit. It is within this historic work and conflict between Rome and the Jews that we find the first known recorded instance of one person mooning another as an insulting gesture, with rather deadly results. Specifically in the Jewish War, Josephus records an event that apparently took place near the temple in Jerusalem during Passover. To quote, one of the soldiers pulled back his garment and, cowering down after an indecent manner, turned his breech to the Jews and spake such words as you might expect upon such a posture. At this, the whole multitude had indignation and made a clamour to Kimanas that he would punish the soldier, while the rasher part of the youth and such as were naturally the most tumultuous fell to fighting and caught up stones and threw them at the soldiers. Upon which Kimanas was afraid lest all the people should make an assault upon him and sent to call for more armed men, who, when they came in great numbers into the cloisters, the Jews were in a very great consternation, and being beaten out of the temple, they ran into the city, and the violence with which they crowded to get out was so great that they trod upon each other and squeezed one another till 10,000 of them were killed, insomuch that this feast became the cause of mourning to the whole nation, and every family lamented their own relations. Of course, it's not really clear from this if the mooning itself was intended to be included in the insulting gesture, or if it was simply necessary to really drive home the farting aspect of the whole thing, which may have been the real insult. Whatever the case, the first known mooning in recorded history apparently not only included a fart in the general direction of someone, but resulted in a riot and the death of reportedly over 10,000 people. From this fact, we are going to go ahead and crown this the deadliest fart in history, and we challenge everyone in the comments to come up with one to beat it. From here, cracking your crack at others has a rather colourful and better documented history, with perhaps the general insulting nature of it deriving from such stinky expulsions to the point where eventually any such flatulence was unnecessary to get the point across. Whatever the case, fast forward from the 1st century AD and we find countless references to the act throughout Europe, particularly in places like merry old England, where the British throughout the Middle Ages had a propensity for flapping their cheeks in the wind at enemies such as the Scots, although the practice does seem to have been prevalent in various parts of Europe at this point. As to specific examples, in 1203, Western Europeans attacked Constantinople, but were initially thwarted by their Byzantine counterparts. Upon retreat, it is recorded in Donald E. Queller et al.'s The Fourth Crusade, quote, abandoning much of their equipment, the leaders of the crusade were constrained to give the order to retreat. As the ships pulled away from the shore, the of Greeks on the walls hooted and jeered at the defeated attackers. Some of them let down their clouts and showed their bare buttocks in derision to the fleeing foe. From here, references to mooning became much more prevalent, including another 13th century account where Italian composer Alberico da Romano got a little upset and decided it was a good idea to drop, quote, his trousers and exposed his rear to the Lord as a sign of abuse and reviling, end quote. From here, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in 1346, during the Battle of Crecy, it's recorded that several hundred Norman soldiers, quote, exposed their backside to the English archers, and many of them paid a high price for doing so. Sadly, no real further detail is given about this unfortunate mooning. Perhaps lending credence to the insulting part of mooning being centered around flatulence or crapping on your foe, whether literally or just in a figurative gesture. In Chaucer's 14th century, the Canterbury Tales, specifically in The Miller's Tale, the character of Alison plays a little trick on prospective lover Absalom. It notes in the middle of a dark night, with Absalom hanging out at Alison's window begging her for a kiss, she ultimately agrees. However, when he goes in for said puckering, he finds, with his mouth, he kissed her naked arse, as she had to quote, at the window out she put her hole. While you might think he'd be happy about skipping first and second base and sliding right into third, Absalom wasn't pleased and later returned to get his revenge, at which point Alison's lover, Nicholas, decided to play his own trick. To quote Chaucer, Nicholas always arisen to piss and thought he would make the joke even better. He should kiss his arse before he escapes. And he opened up the window hastily and he puts out his arse stealthily over the buttock to the thigh and then spoke this clerk, the Absalom, speak, sweet bird, I know not where thou art. This Nicholas immediately let fly a fart as great as if it had been a thunderbolt, so that with the stroke, Absalom was almost blinded, and he was ready with his hot iron, and he smote Nicholas in the middle of the arse. Moving on from there, showing the youth of the world have long since enjoyed the practice of mooning, it's recorded that during the Conference of Badajoz Alves of 1524, the delegates took a break at one point, and while walking, to quote a contemporary account, a boy who stood keeping his mother's clothes, which she had washed, the boy demanded of them whether they were these men who are partitioning the world on behalf of the emperor, and as they answered, yeah, he took up his shirt and showed them his bare ass, saying, come and draw your line through the middle of this. Not just seen as insulting among Europeans, when said people made their way to the Americas, they encountered the Abenaki tribe of Maine, who apparently enjoyed mooning as well. As noted, Charles C. Mann's book, 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, to quote, on Verrazano's next stop, the Maine coast, the Abenaki did want steel and cloth, demanded them in fact, but up north, the friendly welcome had vanished. The Indians denied the visitors permission to land, refusing even to touch the Europeans. They passed goods back and forth on a rope over the water. As soon as the crew members sent over the last items, the locals began showing their buttocks and laughing. Mooned by the Indians, Verrazano was baffled by this barbarous behavior, but the reason for it seems clear. Unlike the Narragansett, the Abenaki had long experience with Europeans. At this point, you might be wondering how and when the practice became known as mooning. While you might be tempted to think that this has something to do with the supposed ancient practice of outhouses featuring a crescent moon cutout and subsequent association with rear expulsions, the reality seems to be the other way around, as we'll get to shortly in dispelling the outhouse crescent moon myth. For the real answer, we turn to the venerable Oxford English Dictionary, who notes the first known instance of someone's backside being referred to as moon occurred in 1756 in the work of The Lie and Memoirs of Mr. Ephraim Tristan Bates, where it states, but his moon shall never be covered by me or Buck till they put down the ready cash and no brummagums, counterfeit coins. As to why one's backside may have first been called this, it is generally thought to be to do with the fact that each side of one's buttocks more or less resembles a crescent moon, as colourfully illustrated by this passage in 1938 Murphy by S. Beckett, where it refers to each side of a woman's backside as a moon, to wit, placing her hands upon her moon's plump and plain. Whatever the case, the act of dropping your pants and exposing your butt crack being referred to as mooning doesn't appear to have become a thing until around the mid-20th century, with the practice itself having an upswing in popularity across universities in the United States in the 1960s. Various references include a July 1964 issue of the Princeton Alumni Weekly, where it states, "All we had was abortive efforts at mooning the Yale team in their dugouts," or in University of Massachusetts Amherst student N.J. Eaton's thesis, Current Adolescent Slang, in which he writes, "Moon, to expose the buttocks. Sin, throw a moon." A March 22nd, 1974 edition of The Guardian further illustrates, "Streaking seems to be the mainly male equivalent of the mainly female practice that cropped up in campuses across the United States in the late 50s and early 60s. This was known as mooning. Mooning consisted of exposing the bottom in the general direction of whoever the mooner wanted to impress, protest to, or affront." Now, this all brings us back to the crescent moon on outhouses. Noteworthy here is that despite it being commonly held that outhouses featuring the crescent moon was a rather ancient thing, it appears this meme likewise has its origin in the mid-20th century upswing in bearing arse. While some of the more traveled among you might know by pointing to historic sites in the United States that you have visited that have outhouses going back potentially even a couple of hundred years and feature a crescent moon cutout, it should be noted that in every known instance, the cutouts were put there in more modern times to fit people's expectations. As one Dr. Adam Brooke Davis of Truman State University and the Missouri Folklore Society states, "These are all excellent examples of historical retrofitting." Of course, as you might expect, descriptions of outhouses and photographs and the like are relatively rare, and surviving examples even more so. As for those surviving examples that have not been retrofitted, we have such cases as an 8-person communal outhouse on the Thomas Leiper estate. This 18th century outhouse is helpfully made of stone, so it has survived the centuries, but no such cutout or symbology is present anywhere on it, door or otherwise. Or as Dr. Davis sums up concerning his extensive research into the matter, "I have never seen a crescent moon shape in an actual outhouse I could confidently date to earlier than about 1960. On that note, as for the first known actual instances of the crescent moon cutout on outhouses, as alluded to, these wouldn't start showing up until around the mid-20th century, first in cartoons and comics. For example, if you troll through examples of old linen postcards from the 1930s to the 1950s, you'll see that on the 1930s side of things, depictions of outhouses in said humorous postcards had no crescent moon adornment, but in later examples, this seemingly became ubiquitous, whether on the door, above it, or on the upper parts of the side walls of the outhouse. So who came up with the crescent moon trope, and why? Well, this isn't clear. Historically, outhouses did frequently feature openings in the rafters for ventilation and light purposes. Some even had cutouts in the doors, but often they were diamond, V, or heart-shaped, or some speculate on this one originally intended to be more bottom-shaped, as it would look like hanging over the hole. These door cutouts were also seemingly for ventilation and light purposes, and also sometimes thought to function as the door handle of sorts. As the aforementioned Dr. Davis sums up concerning the door cutouts, "My grandparents' farm near Hannibal, Missouri, has an outhouse built between 1920 and 1940. The door, as faced from the outside, had its hinges left and no knob or pull. Rather, it had a cutout so that one could slip one's fingers in to grasp it. It permitted light, ventilation, and easy opening. I suggest that this simple expedient came to have some traditional force, and once hardware became available, was still felt to be useful or attractive, and was displaced to the center of the door to break up the flat plane." Of course, if this is correct, it still doesn't explain why the crescent moon cutout is the one latched onto by popular media in the United States, and later beyond versus other options, or even whether the popular media is actually the one that first created it.
Erased from existence. Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory, was a punishment reserved for certain people the Romans decided to dishonor for one reason or another. Rather impressively, it involved trying to get rid of all records that the person ever existed. Understandably, historians aren't aware of any people to whom this dishonor was successfully applied, since if they did, it wouldn't have been successful. They are, however, aware of a number of high-profile cases in which Damnatio Memoriae was decreed, but we still know of the individuals today. Before we get ahead of ourselves, we should discuss what the specifics are behind Damnatio Memoriae itself, and what one would need to do to earn such a punishment. Damnatio Memoriae was normally reserved for those such as senators and emperors whose acts did not reflect well on Rome, or those who committed treason or a number of other serious crimes. Brutal or tyrannical emperors were particularly susceptible to earning a date with the giant eraser of history. The methods used to rid the world of any record of the individual in question included striking the individual's name from all official records, seizing their possessions, and anything bearing their likeness or name, statues, murals, writings, etc., would be destroyed or otherwise defaced. To really rub it in, if the person being stricken from memory just so happened to be dead at the time, which was common, their will would be annulled and their grave defaced. That said, fully removing some of these high-profile people, such as emperors, from history proved to be exceptionally difficult, and despite the Romans' best efforts, at least some of the people who suffered Damnatio Memoriae as a punishment are still in the history books. For example, consider Roman Emperor Maxentius, who, despite being a victim of Damnatio Memoriae in 312 AD at the hands of Emperor Constantine, we still know a lot about. Maxentius's father, Maximian, was also subjected to Damnatio Memoriae in 310 AD by Emperor Constantine. However, Constantine changed his mind, and Maximian was instead deified, essentially making him a god in the eyes of the Roman people, which we're sure he would have enjoyed more if Constantine hadn't forced him to commit suicide in 310 AD. A Roman emperor that was, rather surprisingly, saved from this fate was the famously mad Emperor Caligula. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, his successor, Claudius, immediately shot down the Senate's attempts at removing his nephew's memory from history. This is a particularly notable case in that it is known that the decision to try to remove Caligula from history was heavily influenced by public opinion, suggesting that popular opinion played a part in deciding who to punish via Damnatio Memoriae. Perhaps one of the more dark instances of Damnatio Memoriae is the story of Publius Septimius Gator, who was murdered in his mother's arms on his older brother's Caracalla's orders. After the murder of his brother, Caracalla declared Damnatio Memoriae on his brother's name and had 20,000 people he didn't like executed while he was at it. By all accounts, Caracalla's order was incredibly thorough and few images of Gator survived. However, there was one thing Caracalla couldn't get rid of completely: the millions of coins sporting his brother's face circulating freely throughout his empire. Also, due to Gator's popularity with the people of Rome, Caracalla was forced to give his brother a lavish funeral. Damnatio Memoriae is still practiced on occasion by some people and groups in one form or another. For instance, Stalin was famous for erasing people he didn't like from photos and official documents. The disappearing man is Nikolai Yezhkov, one time very powerful head of the NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. In his post there, he presided over numerous tortures and mass executions during the Great Purge, but later fell out of favor and himself was tortured until he admitted to being a traitor. After this, he himself was purged. Once this happened, he became the vanishing commissar, with records of him, including in photographs, suddenly disappearing, which was no small feat given the high-profile position that Yezhkov had previously held. When Rome burned. The infamous phrase, "Nero fiddled while Rome burned," has come to mean a person who is neglecting their duties, probably by doing something frivolous. Nero is painted as an emperor who didn't care about his people, but it's likely that he didn't deserve such a bad reputation. This is extremely similar to the tale of Marie Antoinette supposedly saying, "Let them eat cake," when hearing the starving masses, when, in fact, she never said this, and popular history's representation of Antoinette has been heavily influenced by the 18th century French, who despised her, mostly because she was Austrian and a prominent member of the aristocracy, rather than because of anything she actually did, per se. Back to Nero. The story goes that a great fire swept through Rome in 64 AD, and Nero played his fiddle in a villa some miles away, ignoring his duty to the great city. In truth, there was such a fire, though its extent is unknown. The fire lasted for 6 days and decimated Rome, with only 4 districts untouched, out of a total of 14. He goes on to state that 10 of the 11 districts that burned were heavily damaged, with 3 of those completely destroyed. However, oddly, there is very little documented mention of the fire from those who actually lived through it. The only Roman historian during that period who even mentioned it at all was Pliny the Elder, and even he only briefly referenced it in passing. Had it been as widespread as Tacitus claimed, one would think that the likes of Plutarch, Epictetus, or other such famed Roman historians who lived through the fire would have mentioned it. And indeed, we see that perhaps it wasn't that great of a fire from the only other documented first-hand account of the scope of the disaster, a letter from Seneca the Younger, where he explicitly stated that only 4 blocks of insulae were burned, a type of apartment building, along with 132 private houses damaged, about 7% of the private houses and 0.009% of the insulae. Not anywhere close as widespread as Tacitus later claimed, though Seneca did say the fire lasted 6 days, as Tacitus stated. As to Nero's reaction to the fire, the first and biggest flaw in the fiddling story is that the fiddle, or violin, didn't actually exist in Nero's time. Historians aren't able to give the exact date for the invention of the violin, but the viol class of instruments to which the violin belongs wasn't developed until at least the 11th century. Many agree that the violin itself wasn't being played until around the 16th century. If Nero actually did play a stringed instrument, and there's no evidence that he did, whether during the burning of Rome or otherwise, it was probably a lyre or a cithara. Okay, so some details can get muddled through history. Did Nero neglect Rome when it burned? Historians argue probably not. Reports do place Nero 35 miles away from Rome at the time of the fire, as he was staying in his villa at Antium. However, an account from Tacitus tells us that he returned to Rome immediately when word of the fire reached him in order to begin relief efforts. As the fire raged on, Nero even opened up his gardens to provide a temporary home for those who were now homeless. He also ordered the construction of emergency accommodation and cut the price of corn, as well as provided food directly so that people could eat. Besides this, he paid for much of these relief efforts out of his own pocket. However, Tacitus also tells us of the rumor that had spread among the masses. While the flames surged through the city, Nero stood on his private stage and sang about the destruction of Troy in a comparison of the two events. Whether or not the rumor had any evidence to back it up, or it was just something made up by the unhappy masses, we don't know, but this and Suetonius's accounts are the most likely source of the fiddle story we hear today. Unfortunately for Nero, at least in the context of this story, he did have a reputation for enjoying concerts and participating in music competitions, so the activity itself wasn't entirely unlikely, even if the timing of the act is highly questionable. While Tacitus claims the singing story was a rumor, Suetonius wrote about it with conviction. However, the story could have been an attempt to further mar Nero's name. Nero faced problems during his reign from the very start, when it was reported that his own mother poisoned his predecessor, Claudius. He was also blamed for the death of Claudius's son, Britannicus, who was being urged to take his proper place as emperor by overthrowing Nero. Numerous other deaths were thought to be committed by Nero's hand, including one of his wives and his own mother. As such, Nero was painted as a man who was difficult for the masses to trust. No one knew how the fire started, and many Romans believed that he had started the fire that burned their city. With the mob out for blood, Nero was forced to turn to a scapegoat and blamed Christians for starting the fire. There were only a small number of Christians in Rome at the time, and they were considered a strange religious sect, so they were an easy target. As Tacitus stated,
"Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from who the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke only in the Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all Christians who pleaded guilty to the fire. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skin of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired."
Even finding someone to blame for the fire didn't help Nero's plea of innocence. In the wake of the fire, he built a palace on top of some of the land cleared by the flames, which people argued he had been planning from the start, though this is highly unlikely as the place he built the new palace was over half a mile away from where the fire started. In addition to a new palace, Nero did provide for the reconstruction of the city, but rebuilding stretched the limits of Rome's treasury at the time. He was forced to devalue Roman currency, which wasn't a popular move. Nero ended up committing suicide, or at least begging his secretary to kill him when he lost the nerve to do it himself 4 years after the fire. Accounts of his life and of the time of the fire are highly contradictory. Further, Suetonius and Tacitus wrote their histories 50 years after Nero died, and Cassius Dio wrote his 150 years later. Many historians also think it likely that Nero was more popular with the people of Rome than he was with his senators, and as all three of the main sources were from the senatorial class, it's likely they carry more than a little bias against him, not unlike what happened with the popular history of Marie Antoinette as mentioned. That said, Tacitus did state that while Nero's death was welcomed by senators, the lower classes mourned his passing. So, in the end, the implication that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, or played the lyre, sang a song, or neglected his duty in any way is likely the result of anti-Nero propaganda and an attempt to tarnish his name. The morality of his actions during his reign is open to debate, but the fiddling or playing music story, at the least, is almost certainly a myth.
It's good to be the emperor, right? You can do emperor stuff and have fun all day long with everyone catering to your every whim. If you, too, would like to be an emperor, congratulations. You can click on the link below and bid on the title of Emperor of Rome. This is, translated into modern terms, what piqued the attention of Didius Julianus, the protagonist of our story today, who, on a fine evening of March the 28th, 193 AD, decided to participate in the weirdest event seen in Rome yet, and Rome had seen many. The bidding for the role of emperor. Chance for a life of epicness, right? Well, let's say winning the bid was the second worst thing to ever happen to Didius, the first thing, of course, being called Didius. To unravel this peculiar story, we must first go back to March the 28th, 193, and a little background leading up to it. To begin with, Commodus, yes, that Commodus, the problematic emperor, also known as Joaquin Phoenix, does not seem to have been killed by a former general turned gladiator in the arena, but was rather strangled in the bath by his wrestling partner in a plot led by Latus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Latus, however, knew how the game was played. You only kill an emperor if you already have a replacement in place ready to step up and prevent chaos and revenge tendencies. Multiple examples from the past, such as the killing of Julius Caesar, had shown that if they didn't have a solid plan as to who would follow, it did not bode well for the plotters. The replacement Latus had in mind was a well-established politician and military commander by the name of Pertinax, and in order to get the rest of the Praetorian Guard on board with the plan and to ensure the easy transition after Commodus had been murdered, Latus promised a huge gift or donative in the name of the new emperor, without clearing it with Pertinax first. The issue would bring Pertinax at odds with the Praetorian Guard. A staunch, honor-bound person, he did not speak the same language as the Praetorian Guard did. He expected that his soldiers would follow orders. They were not to be negotiated with, period. An indication of how unaccustomed the Praetorians were to harsh discipline is that they needed to be bribed by their commander-in-chief in the first place. And then there is the undeniable fact that from the get-go, they were somewhat skeptical about the rise of Pertinax. Unlike most of, well, everybody, the Praetorian Guard was actually quite happy under Commodus. He lived the high life as a gladiator, leading the empire to ruin, sure, but the Praetorian Guard had it pretty easy. They did not guard the Rhine in some cold and soggy province in the north. They lived in Rome, in the so-called Casa Praetoria, at a privileged spot east of the top of Quirinal Hill, not very far from the Termini station in Rome today. When on duty guarding the palace, they could enjoy the debaucheries of Commodus firsthand. It was not just the most honored position in the military, but also the most coveted for its financial benefits and prestige. Now this staunch old man was drilling them as if they were some kind of common provincial soldiers, and on top of everything, he denied them their promised payment in full. So, in the afternoon of March the 28th, 193 AD, a bunch of them, 200 according to the historian Cassius Dio, marched to the living quarters of Pertinax. The poor emperor sent his ally, the Praetorian prefect Latus, to calm his soldiers, but when Latus saw them, he thought it very wise, as a head-saving strategy, to accompany them instead. Soon afterwards, and in fact not long at all after having been proclaimed head of state, the disciplinarian emperor lay dead. He was 66 years old, and the demise of this all-in-all honorable person was caused by nothing else than a lack of skills when it comes to reading the room. In Machiavelli's The Prince, Pertinax would go on to serve as an example of how a prince can easily be hated for good qualities. Latus, seemingly assuming his role as an officer, stated the obvious. Killing the emperor is one thing, not having a replacement on the other hand can be really dangerous, especially since the military commander Pertinax was loved by the common soldiers who could seek revenge. It wasn't as if this sort of thing hadn't happened before. In principle, they didn't care who would become emperor. What they wanted, and that was the reason they clashed with Pertinax in the first place, was the payment due. So they thought of a splendid idea which would be frowned upon by contemporaries: an auction. Yep, the idea was to give the title of emperor to the highest bidder. Rome, of course, descended directly into turmoil. An emperor was always either the son of an emperor, be it adopted or by blood, or he had won the empire fair and square in the field of battle. But buying it, for the honor-bound ancient world, this was unimaginable. The first to begin bidding was a certain Sulpicianus, who was serving as prefect of Rome, kind of like a mayor. He had conveniently arrived at the Praetorian camp so that he could calm the situation, but really he began bidding. Enter Marcus Didius Julianus. Sweet Didius was well connected, but rather the silent type. As a favorite of the mother of Marcus Aurelius, many doors were opened for him, and he had served in some important positions, such as senator and governor of the province of Upper Germany. And there he had enjoyed successes against invading Germanic tribes, which led him to become co-consul, coincidentally with Pertinax in 175. In the coming years, he seemed content with smaller, rather relaxed positions such as in Bithynia, modern northwest Turkey, and North Africa. After that, he returned to Rome, enjoying a calm life. During supper on an uneventful day, the news came. The emperor was dead and the title was up for auction. Tradition dictates that although initially uninterested, his wife and daughter nagged him until he decided to enter the race. But as tradition was often written by biased misogynists, this tale could be a classic example of the popular "women behind all evil" trope, the type of thing with the apple. Whatever the case, Didius did end up wanting to win, so he went to the camp of the Praetorians. It is unclear what the situation with the other bidders was, but at the end there was only Didius who was standing outside the camp, as the soldiers did not let him in, with Sulpicianus inside the camp, who, by the way, was Didius's father-in-law. The soldiers arranged it thus that one would declare his bid, and then they would run to the fence and shout it to the other participants. This went on for a while, with the enthusiasm of the Praetorians rising with each bid. After hours, the amount rose to unimaginable heights. The final offer of Sulpicianus was 20,000 sestertii for each Praetorian soldier. For context, the yearly salary of a simple soldier was something below 2,000 sestertii. After hearing this from the fence, Didius, in a panic move, offered 25,000 per person, to which his father-in-law remained silent, and he had won. To be fair, Didius did show elements of a decent personality, as the first thing he asked as the winner of this weird auction was that the Praetorians spare the life of his rival. This was quite unusual, as normally, when there was more than one candidate for the diadem, only the winner survived. In ancient Rome, the known axiom was the rule: in the Game of Thrones, you either win or die. After this event, the satisfied Praetorians accompanied their candidate for emperor to the Senate, the institution that could ratify the outcome of this farce. Because the senators knew better than to piss off the Praetorian Guard, they just kind of went along with it. And so it was, Didius ruled happily ever after, gloriously leading the empire for 66 whole days. From the get-go, Didius was by most accounts one of the most unpopular emperors ever, mainly due to how he came to power, but also because his first action as emperor was devaluing the currency so that he could pay off the Praetorian Guard. Commodus might have been weird and kind of a clown, but he was also entertaining for the masses. Didius, however, was an embarrassment. As the main sources such as Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta inform us, people were openly mocking and laughing at him whenever he appeared in public, even throwing stones to block his path. Didius's polite gesture of demanding that his co-bidder and father-in-law Sulpicianus be spared was seen as a weakness, adding to his image as a puppet. Outside of Rome, the troops were unamused. 3 different armies rebelled at once, each hailing their commander and emperor. The one closest to Rome was Septimius Severus, who immediately began the march on the city. Didius tried to quickly drill the Praetorians, but their lavish lifestyle and fancy swords had no hope of standing a chance against trained field soldiers. After a few exchanges and some skirmishes, it became clear that even the huge amount of money wasn't worth their life, so they abandoned their chosen emperor en masse, leaving Didius unprotected. Even his former colleagues in the Senate deserted him. Not only did they proclaim Septimius Severus to be the rightful emperor, but they sentenced Didius Julianus to death. And so it was noted in Historia Augusta. Finally, it was proposed that the imperial power be taken away from Julianus by order of the Senate. This was done, and Severus was forthwith acclaimed emperor, while it was given out that Julianus had taken poison. Nevertheless, the Senate dispatched a delegation, and through their efforts, Didius was slain in the palace by a common soldier while beseeching the protection of Caesar, that is to say, Severus. His last words are said to have been from the history of Cassius Dio: "What evil I have done, whom have I killed?" All in all, this guy seems not to have been a bad fellow. According to Historia Augustus, he was very affable at banquets, very courteous in the manner of petitions, and very reasonable in the matter of granting liberty. That's from Historia Augusta. And seeing as his reign began and ended without much support and was too short to make much of an impact on the further history of the empire, it is impossible to say what his leadership might have looked like in other circumstances. Judging by some of the emperors, both in his past and still to follow, he probably wouldn't have been the worst. But buying the title emperor, and with money that he didn't have, and with the armies near Rome, well, what was he thinking? But something good for him now. Ironically, it has to do with the thing that dragged him into the whole debacle, namely coin. Coins of the emperor Didius Julianus are prized by coin collectors, but are also important to archaeologists. Since he ruled for such a gloriously short time, any coins minted during his reign are relatively rare. Furthermore, they are dated with an accuracy archaeologists only vaguely dream of. You will notice that in museums, ancient objects are sometimes dated very vaguely, like a cup of the 5th to 6th century, or if you are lucky, you get something like late 5th century. The reason is that objects rarely give a specific date, let alone the month. The coins do often bear the year they were minted in, but this is also partially unreliable. The key here is continuity. A long-lived king would issue many coins, and if he belonged to a dynasty, those coins would continue circulating long after his death. But an emperor who ruled for only 66 days, first of all, his coins will be rare. Second, the dating can be relatively precise, as they were possibly not circulated after his death, also given the various monetary reforms that followed. If found by archaeologists amidst a collapsed living room, they almost have the exact date, spring to midsummer of the year 193 AD, and this will help date the various items that the coin was found with. And since we are at the subject of coin, time to talk about a bit of propaganda and once more feel some sympathy for Didius. The kind of imagery put on the coins was very carefully chosen, as in a world without press and TV, it was the most widely spread mass medium with which the political agenda would have been propagated on one side and the emperor's face on the other, the aptly named head side. So Augustus would have shown on the tail side a crocodile with the sign Egypto Capta, Egypt captured, to declare his victory over Egypt. Other coins would show personifications of victory or Rome or clemency, referring to various achievements of the emperor in question. Didius, however, had nothing to boast about. Some coins of Didius show the horn of Almathea or cornucopia. It is the magical horn of plenty, traditionally held by Fortuna, the goddess of luck. It could be an indication of the hope that he could find the money he needed for the payments, and with some luck, all would be fine, and he could figure out a way to bring his people to prosperity and plentiness, but, well, alas.
The Colosseum is one of the most iconic landmarks in Rome and incredibly popular with tourists. Movies would have you think that chariot races, gladiator shows, and battle simulations always took place there, but that isn't true. The Colosseum was finished relatively recently, in 80 AD, but for its completion, a more popular venue for such things was the much more massive Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus was arguably the largest structure in ancient Rome, with the capacity to seat 250,000 people, according to Pliny, roughly a quarter of Rome's population at the time, and historians today think the number might have been a tad smaller than Pliny said, around 150,000 rather than 250,000, but either way, it was really big. It was built around the 6th century BC, well before the Colosseum was even a thought. The 5th king of Rome, Tarquinius Priscus, created the track, which would later be used for chariot races, positioning it between the Palatine and Aventine hills. Historically, the area is known as the possible location of the famous rape of the Sabine woman. If you're unfamiliar, it's a Roman legend that Romulus, the founder of Rome, negotiated with the Sabines, who lived in the area, to let him and his followers, who were mostly male, marry their women. When they refused, Romulus hosted chariot races, which distracted the men and allowed the Romans to kidnap the Sabine women. The Roman historian Livy assures us that no sexual assault took place. Rather, Romulus reasoned with the women and offered them citizenship and the ability to give birth to free men if they married the Roman men. Whether true or not, what better place to set up the racetrack for subsequent chariot races? The main purpose of the Circus Maximus was indeed to hold chariot races as well as provide a venue for the Ludi Romani, or Roman Games. The games were often sponsored by rich, powerful Romans and were used to honor the gods. Ludi could be full-day or half-day events and included all manners of entertainment, from chariot racing, gladiatorial displays, plays, parades, religious ceremonies, and feasts. There was something for everyone at the Circus Maximus. The space was also used to celebrate triumphs or successes on the battlefield. For instance, Tarquin the Proud celebrated his triumph there as a sort of homage to the god Jupiter for his victory over the Paemecia. The circus underwent numerous improvements over the many centuries it was in use. The first Etruscan king created a raised wooden platform to seat Rome's rich and famous, while his grandson added additional seating for the commoners. Around 50 BC, Caesar ordered that the seating be extended around the track, which resulted in the largest seating capacity the Circus Maximus had yet seen. However, it proved to be prone to damages. In 31 BC, a fire swept through the stadium, destroying many of the seats that Caesar had so recently built. It was rebuilt, but another fire during Emperor Nero's time saw further destruction. In addition, the area was notorious for flooding, as a stream had to be redirected to provide enough room for the circus's construction. It was rebuilt out of stone around the end of the 1st century AD, likely to avoid further fire and water damage. Initially, the ludi were held annually, or a couple of times a year. However, Rome was constantly expanding. Soon, ludi became something of a status symbol for those hosting them. The need to impress, combined with the popularity of the shows and games, resulted in more and more games being held. By the 2nd century BC, the number of games had grown considerably. Around 57 days were dedicated to ludi, or over one every week. The emperors of Rome were pressured to build specialized venues to host a variety of different events at once. So, at this point, while the circus remained a popular place to hold chariot races, many of the other games moved location. This brings us to the Colosseum, originally called the Flavian Amphitheatre, with construction beginning around 72 AD under the reign of Emperor Vespasian. The Colosseum was well designed in the shape of an ellipse, allowing for seating all around as well as for sound from the ground level to be relatively easily heard throughout the amphitheatre. It also had significantly smaller capacity than the Circus Maximus, able to only seat around 55,000 viewers. Nevertheless, the Colosseum replaced the circus as the prime space for gladiatorial shows and staged animal hunts called Damnatio. There are even reports that simulated sea battles took place there at one time, but it's unclear today how exactly that worked. Needless to say, the games remained extremely popular throughout the years. The Colosseum was actually kept in use until the 1300s, when an earthquake left part of it in shambles. The stone that fell was used on other buildings, and a religious order moved in. The church continued to hold on to the Colosseum well into the 1800s. The Circus Maximus didn't fall out of use until the 6th century AD, having been used for over 1,000 years at that point. The stones of the structure were also gradually taken away to be used on other buildings, while the actual chariot track was buried under water and soil. It was excavated starting in the 19th century. Today, the circus is a park used for gatherings, concerts, and celebrations, a modern twist on an ancient venue. The Colosseum is, of course, a popular tourist attraction, with millions of people visiting every year. It's also been used as a venue for Roman Catholic religious ceremonies in recent years, though large spectacles are no longer an option due to the fragile state of the monument and the minimal seating that survives. Bonus facts. Building such huge monuments takes a lot of money. The Colosseum was largely funded by money taken from the Jewish temple at the Siege of Jerusalem. Bonus fact 2. The site of the Colosseum was actually heavily populated originally. However, when the famous 64 AD fire spread through the city, started, some people believe, at the Circus Maximus, Emperor Nero snatched up the ruined land and built the Domus Aurea, his grandiose palace, on top of the charred land. However, his palace was later torn down. Bonus fact 3. The chariots that raced at the Circus Maximus were color-coded and could be pulled by teams that consisted of between 4 and 12 horses. The horses that won became famous throughout Rome. The charioteers also saw a lot of fame and riches. The most famous charioteer of his time was Scorpus, who reportedly won a whopping 2,000 races.
A commonly touted notion is that Julius Caesar was born via what is now called a caesarean section after his notable birth. But, well, is this actually true? To begin with, the first known instance of Caesar's birth being noted to be in this manner didn't occur until the 10th century Byzantine Greek historical encyclopedia, the Suda, where it reads, "The emperors of the Romans received this name from Julius Caesar, who was not born, for when his mother died in the 9th month, they cut her open, took him out, and named him thus, for in the Roman tongue, dissection is called Caesar." It turns out, though, that Aurelia Cotta, Caesar's mother, lived all the way to around 54 BC, seemingly dying about 10 years before Julius Caesar was assassinated, though some sources do claim she outlived him. Either way, she definitely survived his birth. This is significant because C-sections up until very modern times were a death sentence. That's not to say they didn't happen. In fact, in Roman law called lex Caesarea, lex means the law and Caesarea imperial, so literally imperial law, it stated that if a woman died, the baby had to be taken from the womb, even if it too was dead. This This was established in the time of Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, 715 to 673 BC, hundreds of years before Caesar's time. This was seemingly mostly for religious reasons, but sometimes the baby could be saved in this way, particularly when it was determined that the woman would probably die anyway, such as if she was bleeding a lot or something like that. Thus, they'd sometimes go ahead and perform the procedure while she was still barely clinging to life to at least save the baby. As Aurelia did not die in childbirth, and the only way that have performed the procedure was if she was dead or near death, we can be reasonably certain Caesar was not born this way, as being near death and then being sliced open in a procedure that seemingly universally killed the woman by itself is generally not a good combination for survivability. Also, Aurelia was no plebeian. She was the daughter of a Roman consul and also the granddaughter of another Roman consul and a member of an extremely prominent family. Had she miraculously survived a C-section, this would have likely been recorded somewhere, and certainly contemporary historians documenting Julius Caesar's life would have found this extremely noteworthy. In fact, it turns out that the first known C-section where both the mother and the child survived isn't thought to have been performed until the late 16th century, occurring in Switzerland. Funnily enough, it was supposedly not performed by any sort of doctor, but by a pig gelder, that's a castrator, named Jacob Neufer, who operated on his own wife. The story goes that after his wife labored unsuccessfully for a couple of days, he made a single cut in her stomach and took the baby out, and then sewed her up like the pigs he regularly dealt with. The woman supposedly then went on to have 5 more children, including a set of twins. It should be noted, though, that as the hard documentation to back up this story is pretty scant, some sources question the reliability of this, as the first surviving documented account of the story didn't occur until nearly a century after the fact. Moving on to better documented instances, we have to jump across the pond to America, where the first known C-section where the woman survived didn't occur until 1794, with Dr. Jesse Bennett performing the procedure on his wife Elizabeth Bennett, which must have been quite a heart-wrenching thing to do, given he would have assumed he was killing his wife in the process of saving their child. Nevertheless, she and the child survived the procedure. An even more interesting and well-documented story is that of the first British surgeon to successfully perform the procedure. This was a person who went by the name of James Barry, but whose birth name was actually Margaret Ann Bulkley. We'll have more on her in the bonus facts in a bit. But getting back to Caesar and the C-sections, it's interesting to note that even the Oxford English Dictionary seems to back up the claim that Caesar was born via caesarean, defining the word as the delivery of a child by cutting through the walls of the abdomen when delivery cannot take place in the natural way, as was done in the case of Julius Caesar. However, giving them the benefit of the doubt here, they may not actually be meaning the ruler of Rome, Julius Caesar. You see, Pliny the Elder noted the name Caesar came from the Latin word to cut, which is sedere. He further stated that one of Caesar's ancestors was born via C-section and was named as such, and that the name was passed down to the eventual ruler of Rome, writing, "The first of the Caesars was so named from him having been removed by an incision in his mother's womb." And indeed, if you look up his family tree, both Julius and Caesar were common family names, with the first to bear the Caesar name in the Roman ruler's lineage being named Numerius Julius Caesar. So, if we're being very generous, it's always possible the OED was referring to this Julius Caesar. Or they're just wrong, which even the best sources, and they are one, sometimes are. Everybody gets stuff wrong. There are no exceptions to this, no matter how hard you might try. In any event, as to whether caesarean section was named after the most famous Julius Caesar, thanks to the common misconception here that he was born this way, well, this isn't clear, but most etymologists do not think it was the original inspiration, given how common the term and similar ones were before the aforementioned 10th century mention, and given how well known these Latin terms were to physicians throughout the centuries where the term appears to have been established. For example, before this, one term for babies cut from the womb after the mother died was caesone. That said, many still claim it must have been named after Caesar, noting that many languages that use some variant of the caesarean term sometimes literally translate it as emperor's cut. However, again, it's noteworthy that Caesarea in Latin means imperial, and there is the connection with the procedure and the lex Caesarea, among others, so this doesn't necessarily mean the etymology of these various other languages' terms are connected to Julius Caesar himself. So that's the Caesarean part. If you're wondering about the section, that is thanks to a physician named Jacques Guillemot. In his 1598 book on midwifery, he chose to change the name from Caesarean operation to Caesarean section, and the latter stuck. This is in reference to the Latin sextus, which is past participle of sectare, meaning to cut. And now for some bonus facts. Margaret N. Buckley was an Irish woman who, thanks to connections via her then-deceased famed artist uncle, James Barry, became acquainted with a doctor by the name of Edward Fryer, who would become her tutor and mentor, a Venezuelan general by the name of Francisco de Miranda, and a man named William Godwin, who happened to be the widower of the author of Vindication of the Rights of Women, Mary Wollstonecraft. At some point, possibly partially due to Margaret's semi-impoverished situation and struggling to get work as a tutor, or maybe just because she really wanted to be a doctor, the group got the idea for Margaret to disguise herself as a man so she could attend medical school. She then took the name of James Barry in homage to her deceased famous uncle and officially entered school as his nephew. It has been speculated that her original plan was to eventually resume her original identity and travel with General Francisco de Miranda back to Venezuela, where she would be allowed to work as a doctor despite being a woman, thanks to the general, but this isn't actually clear. Whether there is any merit to this or not, around the time she was graduating medical school in the summer of 1812, not without controversy as it was assumed because of her slight build and high-pitched voice, she must have been lying about her age, though her connection to her famous deceased uncle helped smooth things over, the general was arrested and would later die in prison. So, had that actually been the plan, it didn't work out. Whatever the case, what she actually did was keep her assumed identity and join the British Army, though it's unclear how she got past the physical. But, well, she did, and the military sent Barry around the world: Canada, Jamaica, India, and Malta, among others. One of her biggest accomplishments took place in South Africa in 1826. While she was stationed there, she performed a cesarean section on a woman, and said woman survived. As mentioned, it was the first known instance of a British surgeon performing the surgery with both mother and child surviving, with the boy child ultimately being named after her. Sort of. He was named Barry. And now for another bonus fact. Speaking of things often thought to be named after Caesar, but not really, well, there's the Caesar salad. This was actually named after a guy called Caesar Cardini, who was an Italian-born chef who immigrated to the United States after World War I. Despite having a home in San Diego, the Cardini family operated a restaurant in Tijuana, Mexico, primarily because of Prohibition, which resulted in many Americans going to Tijuana to drink, so the restaurant business was booming there. There are various stories surrounding Cardini's inspiration for inventing the Caesar salad. According to Caesar's daughter, on the 4th of July 1924, Caesar was running short on supplies due to an unexpected rush of customers. In order to not have to turn customers away, he concocted a salad and a dressing out of some of the remaining ingredients that he had lying around. Another story by a partner of Caesar, Paul Maggiora, said the Caesar salad was actually made for American airmen from San Diego and was called Aviator Salad. Caesar's brother, Alex, also claimed that the original name was Aviator Salad and that he was the one who invented it, not Caesar. Yet another story from a retired airman backs up the Aviator Salad name, but not that Alex Cardini invented it. In his story, he claims that after a long night of drinking, several of the soldiers missed curfew and had to stay at Caesar's restaurant for the night. When they woke up in the morning, Caesar made them a salad, which he called Aviator Salad, and is now today known as Caesar salad. Whatever the true origin, it is clear that this particular type of salad was made popular at Caesar Cardini's restaurant. As for its spreading, the salad also got a popularity boost when, in 1937, Manny Wolfe, a Hollywood screenwriter for Paramount, began distributing the recipe around to various restaurants in the United States. Caesar salad spread to Europe is generally attributed to Mrs. Wallis Warfield Simpson, who was a mistress and eventual wife of Prince Edward VIII of Wales. Simpson often frequented Caesar's restaurant when she was in the area, and during her travels began instructing other chefs how to make it, though she couldn't ever get them to get the dressing quite right, which was a problem in a lot of restaurants that had been serving the salad. As a result of this, by 1948, demand for the dressing for a Caesar salad became so great that Caesar started Caesar Cardini Foods with his daughter Rosa. With this company, they began selling bottled Caesar salad dressing.
Some goth guys are walking down the street is a phrase that would cause very different reactions in the 20th and the 4th centuries. The how and why of the same word being used to describe barbarians in the late antiquity and modern goths in the 21st century is a rather interesting one, so let's dive in. Starting with modern times, the goth subculture is not as old as you may think, dating back no further than the early 1980s, despite taking inspiration from earlier periods, particularly where clothing is concerned. It all began in the UK as a side phenomenon of a music genre so-called gothic rock. The first band to be labelled thus was actually The Doors, as far back as 1967. Alice Cooper, David Bowie, the Velvet Underground, and the Sex Pistols also being considered forebears of the genre. The album to be called the first goth album was Nico's The Marble Index from 1968, with the singer's looks becoming a prototype for the subculture to follow, as well as the 1976 debut of The Damned, whose vocalist Dave Vanian deliberately played on his former occupation as a gravedigger and dressed like a vampire. However, as a distinct music style, gothic rock did not pick up real steam until the late 1970s and early 1980s, with notable artists beginning with Circus and the Banshees and extending to the likes of Joy Division, Bauhaus, and The Cure. An important date in its history is July the 21st, 1982, when the Batcave Club opens in London, providing a venue for the scene and leading to its rise in popularity. Anne Rice's 1976 novel Interview with a Vampire also played its part by giving a popular platform to the romanticizing of the darkly supernatural but sensitive protagonist. As its own genre, gothic rock took inspiration from 19th century gothic literature and its themes, generally sounding darker, more melancholic, or dramatic. In the lyrics, death, tragedy, and the supernatural were also romanticized, and the present state of the world condemned and rejected. Elements and tropes from horror films further shaped the look and sound of the artists and their fans. Music is, in fact, still a big part of the goth scene, though tastes have diversified and now also include dark wave, cold wave, and ethereal wave, as well as death rock and post-punk. As for fashion, in the words of Ted Polhamuse, goth fashion is a profusion of black velvets, lace, fishnets, and leather tinged with scarlet or purple, accessorized with tightly laced corsets, gloves, precarious stilettos, and silver jewelry depicting religious or occult themes. The fact that these fashion choices are made by both male and female goths is only one component of non-compliance with traditional perceptions of gender and sexuality. The modern goth subculture has, of course, not remained in the UK alone, but spread throughout the world. As for the name itself being applied, as nice as it would be to have an easy explanation for the origin of the term, it has undergone a lot of change. For example, in the 20th century, it merely translated to what was to be found as Gothic, meaning old-fashioned, slightly scary, with the air of brooding darkness. Literature and art forms from that time mainly deems buildings with tall windows, abandoned and haunted mansions, and other such edifices of dark allure as Gothic. So how did this term come to be applied to such architecture and literature? Well, both of these are in some way or another misleadingly associated with a real people, the Goths, going back a couple of thousand years. The first misconception has to do with the dubbing of medieval art as Gothic. This goes as follows. During the medieval times in Europe, one of the first major developments in architecture was the so-called Romanesque art, which to some extent can be seen as a combination of late antiquity. For example, in buildings you can notice this by the rounded arches and the heavy form. As time passed, however, architects began experimenting, especially wanting to construct the large cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries as a staple of innovation and power of the cities building them. Amongst the innovations was the use of the flying buttresses, so that the load of each huge church or building would be spread out at the side piers. With this technique, you can have a very tall nave as well as more windows, but they have to be long and narrow. The other innovation, coming from the east, possibly during the Crusades, was the pointed arch, strongly contributing to that distinctive feel of what we call Gothic, used in doors and rib vaults in churches, castles, and any type of building. In painting and sculpture, despite their painful attention to detail, like each hair individually painted in some examples, they did not emphasize naturalism or expression in favor of the stilled forms that we today perceive as apathy and sometimes as unsettling. Furthermore, the paintings lacked the feeling of space, as if everything was on the foreground. It should be clear that these developments were done not by any invading Gothic tribes. Rather, centers for this were France and Flanders, though many examples are known from Italy. With the dawn of the Renaissance in Italy in the 14th and especially in the 15th century, it was all the rage to return to the lifelike splendid Greco-Roman standards for the arts, which glorified life and movement in contrast to the older medieval art. Somewhere along there, an arrogance towards this edgy non-smoothness of the Gothic appeared, and hence its name, referring to the Goths, who to the popular mind had destroyed and vandalized the ancient civilization along with its art. The ragged edges of the Gothic churches were thus seen as barbaric by the people of that time, even though it was their grandfathers who had created them. In the common mind, the false association was made that these Gothic structures and painting style had replaced the Greco-Roman one, and hence the word Gothic was used as a slur to denote the unrefined. It was a Renaissance-era burn for someone to call your mama's house Gothic. In any event, 4 centuries later, around the 1800s, what had started as a revolution had slowly become establishment in turn. Classicism saw itself as a continuation of the Renaissance ideals in art and architecture. This ranged from classical music to the Corinthian columns of the United States Senate or the National Capitol columns. Around that time, along with the revolutionary spirit, there was an awakening in art, looking back at the slightly ragged past and finding appreciation in the Gothic church ruins, even in traditionally romantic painters like their ultimate representative, Caspar David Friedrich. This phenomenon has even received the very appropriate artistry term ruinlust, and went as far as the intentional building of fake ruins, though these might have the style of Greek temples right next to parts of medieval castles. As one may guess, faithful imitation was not the purpose here, but rather the evocation of a lost past and all the feelings that come with that notion. Additionally, distinctly so-called Gothic elements began to appear in the otherwise peaceful landscape settings, such as in the work of American painter John Quindor. And for some authors, Romanticism also simply wasn't emotional enough and needed a tad more darkness added to it, making their works priority, not simply beauty, but a range of feelings. The eerie and macabre came back into fashion, giving us Mary Shelley's Frankenstein right next to the sheer romantic drama of Lord Byron. Gothic novels emerged in the mid to late 1700s, with possibly the first example of one being The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, but became properly popular in the 1800s and lasted into the early 1900s. During this time, notable authors include Emily Bronte, Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson, Daphne du Maurier, Bram Stoker, and even Oscar Wilde in works such as The Picture of Dorian Gray. Protagonists were mostly isolated. There was a clear and particularly evil villain. The setting was the appropriate decaying Gothic edifice. There were elements of the supernatural, of mystery, horror, and romance. In short, an entirely new genre was invented, and so were many of our favorite horror villains, monsters, stories, and tropes. Music too began to shift, a transition from the joyful tunes of Mozart to angst-ridden Beethoven. One of the results of these tendencies of their time is the Gothic revival, or the Neo-Gothic, where Gothic arches appeared in modern buildings of the 19th century. This led to wildly evocative, if terribly impractical, edifices such as Fontell Abbey, a vast building including a 90-meter tower conceptualized and realized by William Thomas Beckford and architect James Watt. The trends overwhelmed Central Europe and spread to America as well. One of the building types emerging from this was the Victorian mansion. This type of rich house went out of favor in the early 20th century, and owing to economic factors, many were deserted. Slowly, they began to be associated with the old, decaying nobility and became the archetype of the scary or even haunted house. Thus, the gap is bridged to the late 20th century's perception of Gothic as a gloomy, dark, noir-like element. Batman appropriately lives in Gotham. But what about the OG Goths themselves? We first encounter them as yet another tribe that made advances into the Roman territories of modern Germany, France, and Belgium. As to the various individual names of these peoples, it's not always clear where they stem from. As in the case of the Swabians or later Thuringians, it is not clear if an acronym or ethnonym, a name they were either given by someone else or one they called themselves. The Goths appeared rather late in the historiography, prominently around the 3rd century, although mentions of them could be found much earlier, as some travelers mention the Gautones, people around the area of what is modern-day Poland. Additionally, Pliny the Elder quotes an even earlier source, the ancient Greek traveler Pythias, whose travels lead him to the northern lands of Thule. At some point, he encounters a northern people called the Guiones, who traded in amber, whom some scholars identify with the Gautones people and the Goths. Trade in amber is a nice piece of evidence, as Scandinavia was a major exporter of amber from ancient times until today. Together with the early reference to Poland and the Vistula River, we have a location that is traditionally considered the home of the Goths, the Baltic. This is also supported by the early work of Getica, written by a citizen of Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century of Gothic origin called Jordanes. Supporters of this theory show the island Gotland in South Sweden and some other places that bear their name as a possible origin, but of course this is not accepted by all. The Chernyakov culture of the later 3rd and 4th centuries AD beside the Black Sea, and the Polish and Belarusian Weibach cultures of the 1st to 3rd centuries provide evidence of a Gothic migration down the Vistula to the Black Sea, but no clear trail leads to Scandinavia. In any case, from somewhere in northern Europe should be close enough for most people. As for the meaning, the various etymologies never agree with each other. One of the most common but also most boring concepts is that it just meant people. A slightly more out there hypothesis is that it meant the Cedars. Whatever the case, despite their late appearance, the Goths quickly developed into one of the main players in late antiquity, categorized into two main groups, one called the Ostrogoths, meaning the Goths of the East, since they ended up in Italy, and the other being called the Visigoths, meaning Goths of the West, since they ended up in Spain, but originally the Visigoths entered the game in the Balkans. The Visigoths crossed the Danube in the 370s, and in 378, in the Battle of Adrianople, the unthinkable happened. The Roman Emperor Valens not only was the first emperor to lose a battle within the empire, but also the first one to die in battle within it. After this shock, the group were left mostly unchecked, and the people relied on the walls of the cities to protect the populace, while the Visigoths went on pillaging and burning. Their leader, Alaric, finally even pillaged Rome in 410 AD. That said, it should be noted that despite their valiant efforts, which should give the Goths their prize for being the most prolific pillagers, our word for destruction is connected to the Vandals, who sacked Rome 40 years later. But as always, there is another side. Out of all the Germanic people, the Goths were integrated the most into Roman society. With intermarriages with the Roman elite and positions within the army, the whole empire was under their rule in rather difficult times. Those leaders were never officially named emperors, as the Roman elite would not care for a low-class Goth to be emperor, but some personalities, such as Stilicho, in fact did have that job in all but name. Further, the Visigoths became foederati, allies of Rome in 418, only 8 years after the sacking of the city. Also, they adopted Christianity at a very early stage in the late 4th century, being the first Germanic people to do so 100 years before the Franks. In this development, the missionary work of the bishop Ulfilas is noted, under whom the Bible was translated into the Gothic language around 350 AD, making it the first Bible in the Germanic language, a rather important event for linguists. This early translation gives a very interesting insight into the language, which is the oldest recorded Germanic language, of which English is a branch of. So, although incomprehensible to modern English speakers, some elements will seem familiar. As an example, haben is to have, gibben is to give. Despite their assimilation, in the public memory, however, the Goths' image survived as a menace, with pillaging in the midst of the chaos of the eve of the fall of the Roman Empire. An issue was also that the Christian dogma they were initially converted to, one called Arianism, was and is considered heretical, which caused other internal problems. Entering medieval times, the Ostrogothic kingdom officially ruled in Italy under Odoric, who accepted the abdication of the last Roman emperor, a 13-year-old boy called Romulus Augustulus. The Visigoths were established to the west, and Goth generally became a collective name engulfing many groups that were not related to each other. In this vein, the Gothic invasions also include the Vandals, Alans, etc. Slowly, they were assimilating into the various regions they inhabited, taking on the Italian and Spanish languages. One of their enduring legacies are some loanwords. For example, Italian has a number of words with Germanic rather than Latin origin. It should also be noted here briefly that a less celebrated branch of OG Goths is the Crimean Goths, who lasted into the 18th century in Crimea near the Balkans. Unlike some of their forebears, their impact on world history is minimal, with interactions mainly with the Slavic populations to the north and Byzantium to the south. Slowly, however, they disappeared, with the last mention of them being in the 1780s. No violence seems to be the cause of their downfall. They just seem to have integrated into the Crimean Tatar and Crimean Greek populations, but at least they've managed to make it to within 2 centuries of the modern Goth culture. In any event, after all this, one thing we can say for certain is that the original Gothic tribes would not feel a great kinship with the modern Gothic subculture or art and literature, and while particular pagan elements prevail in modern Goth, the modern Goths, likewise with their general active practicing of non-violence, also might be a bit put off by all the pillaging of their namesake forebears.